You're listening to The Alchemist Ring, audiobook performed by author Jason Lee Willis. Part 2, The Resurrection of the White Zombie. Chapter 19, Tilbury, England, May 23rd, 1701. Jimmy Duke slipped his feet back into his boots as he sat on the edge of the bed, which still held the whore he'd found at the tavern. Unlike whores found at brothels, a whore found in a tavern needed a place to sleep for the night, which is why she drank all of his wine and ate the last of his food. Even after he'd spent his last bit of lust, Duke still needed her for one last thing, so he took his time getting dressed. After a few minutes of gathering his belongings, she woke. What time is it? It's quickly approaching noon, which means I have to vacate the room soon. Do you want to come with me to the hanging? I could buy you lunch before I have to leave. Lunch perked her right up. Of course, I'd love to see the hanging, especially after what happened to you. Well, then start getting dressed and we'll watch the hanging together. Duke didn't bother to learn her name, for in a few more hours, he'd be on the English Channel en route to the Caribbean. I think I understand why you're called a bosom's mate, she raised an eyebrow. When will you be back in England again? Jimmy rolled his eyes, annoyed. First of all, it's a bosun, not a bosom. One is tits and the other one is anchors. I'm in charge of the anchors and hull repair. Jimmy Duke was 26, but felt as if he were already an old man. His arms were a series of cuts, gouges, bruises from a decade on the ocean, and his boyish looks were now rubbed raw by wind and spray. The sun had turned his golden locks a bleached shade of white, but he still had his rugged physique and dimples. When will I be back? I can't honestly tell you. For the first time in a decade, I'm a passenger. I'll need to find a new crew when I return. Where will you go? I have friends waiting back in the Caribbean. Perhaps they will have it all sorted out by the time I return. I hope they're still waiting. You came all this way just to see a man hanged? It's our mission. After what he did to me, absolutely. Fuck him and all pirates like him, Jimmy partially bluffed. Another pirate entered his mind, Captain Legrand. Gareth Legrand taught him a trick about lying. The previous night, he told the whore a story about betrayals and mutinies, how he and a dozen other men ended up marooned on an island, left for dead on the far side of the world. Instead of using the name of the real enemy, Robert Culliford, he used another pirate name that justified his presence in London, Captain Kidd. They say he is the last of them, the whore interrupted. The last of what? Duke asked. The pirates who killed the Indian princess. The Ganji Swai? Duke began to question the lies about Kidd, but let them go. It wouldn't surprise me if the bastard was involved in that bit of devilry. He isn't the last of them. Doll Zeal and Long Ben Avery are still out there. I heard Long Ben Avery died in a shipwreck, which is why no one's been able to find him. Faking your death is one way to become anonymous, Duke said, thinking again of Legrand, and then of the other dozen men who'd survived torture at the hands of Robert Culliford. Let's get this over with. He double-checked his belongings, making sure his personal items were secure, and then led the whore out of the room and tavern. Oh, good God. Duke despaired as he saw a large crowd already gathered at Execution Dock. Unlike Greater London, whose crowds plugged the roads leading to Wapping, the little village of Tilbury was tucked in behind the docks, allowing him a good view of the execution, as well as a quick escape if necessary. Legrand warned us of spies, Duke thought as he walked arm in arm with the whore, and for that reason, he did his best to look like a curious local. Standing on a deck overlooking Execution Dock, Duke scanned the crowd for familiar faces to no avail. I feel like I am the last one. When they brought out the doomed man, Duke almost gasped. He looked so small. The whore scoffed. I found small men can be the most cruel, and big men like yourself can be the kindest. The crowd recoiled with boos and hisses, but the doomed man in the white tunic no longer appeared capable of killing a man with his bare hands. He looked frightened, and already dead. Gareth Legrand staged a bloodless mutiny 3 years earlier, and for all intents and purposes, Captain Kidd never even learned of it. Before Culliford returned their disgraced captain to them, Kidd explained his great scheme. If Kidd hadn't done what Legrand predicted, they would have mutinied. Instead, Kidd walked right into the trap set for him by Newton. Joining the prisoner upon the stage were a series of magistrates and officials. A year after being arrested in Boston and a lengthy court battle in Amsterdam and London, the legend only grew, and the public execution of Captain William Kidd had become a spectacle. "I can't hear what they're saying," Duke muttered as the announcements were made and the rope prepared. Legrand had been specific, though. Duke was to linger in reserve, near the water, ready to ferry the others away as quickly as possible. Even though he couldn't see them, they were there, waiting. "I thought you would be happy," the whore said. "Captain Kidd killed many of my friends," Duke lied, thinking of the snake Culliford. "I'm glad he's been brought to justice, but it is still a bitter day for me, thinking of what he took." In truth, Captain Kidd had killed one of his close friends, a gunner named William Moore. The two had quarreled over attacking a Dutch ship, and in frustration, Kidd threw a bucket at Moore, who shockingly fell dead from the head wound. For his crime, Kidd was arrested in Boston, but now, upon the decks of London, he stood accused of piracy, which meant Gareth Legrand was right about the puppet masters. With a noose around his neck, Captain Kidd spoke his last words, which were too soft to be heard from the distant deck overlooking the execution. The lever was pulled, but instead of Kidd's neck breaking, the rope unexpectedly snapped, and the captain of the Adventure prize fell to the decking like a newborn calf. Chaos ensued on the platform. "He deserves death, but not humiliation." "It's a sign from God!" someone shouted from the crowd. "He paid his price! Release him!" Was that Murray? A soft roar came up from the crowd, but the officials on the deck quickly procured a new rope, looped it around his neck, and hauled him up to be slowly strangled. Kidd jerked and convulsed for several minutes instead of succumbing to a quick death from the force of the noose. "I think God broke the rope just to make him suffer," the horde said. As an American, he'd hoped she'd help him blend in with the crowd. "Get away from me," Jimmy muttered and flashed his killer's eyes at the woman. She left without another word. He stayed at the railing after much of the crowd began to disperse, watching as they transferred Kidd's body into the metal gibbet, which would hang over where the Thames opened up to the Atlantic. None of these sons of bitches even understood why he was hanged. The answer came walking across the open square in the form of Drake Murray. Murray was another bosun, a smaller, portly man with a quick mind and even quicker fists. Duke learned the meaning of the word pugilist, along with how quick those fists truly were, shortly after the American crew took possession of the new warship, Adventure Galley. While the original sailors were kids, New York men, the operations of the ship now fell to Murray, and the English bulldog quickly put him in his place. That was 6 years ago, ironically at the same place Captain Kidd now hung. "Legrand was right," Murray said as he joined Duke at the rail. "Kidd was betrayed by the men who hired him." You do know we could walk away right now. No one knows who we are. We could jump on a new ship and leave all of this Legrand business behind. I mean, fuck that foppy Frenchman. But what about adventure and the treasure? How could I walk away from that? Yet, here you stand. Is it greed or vengeance that keeps you here? Kid didn't deserve this. He never would have turned himself in if he knew his powerful friends actually wanted him dead. On this we agree. Kid was a miserable bastard, and this is justice for what he did to Moore and the others. But this is also proof that this conspiracy goes as deep as Legrand claimed. If he's right about all of this, then I'm standing here because we'll soon be wealthy men. The two crewmen waited as the large crowd dispersed. Do you see that fella in yellow with the red cap? Duke asked. Is that Naro? Murray shook his head. It's some foreign diplomat. Apparently, they show up whenever there's a pirate to be hung, just to report back to their Mughal emperor. No. Look, that's Bond, he said with relief. He moves like him. Why would he be wearing those ridiculous clothes? Both men watched from 50 yards away as the yellow-garbed diplomat walked along the boardwalk and then deftly slipped in an alley between the two small shops. Less than a minute passed, and a much more familiar man emerged. Instead of the ornate yellow jama and red turban, the familiar red shirt, black vest, and brown pants of the old sailing master affirmed Duke's sharp eyes. With the cap gone, Bond's white hair and wiry mustache could be seen from a distance. Decades older than any other shipmate, the lean Bond moved with the light steps of a young man. As he neared the two sailors, he leaned in to say, "We're not safe here any longer." Duke turned to see Bond already 10 paces ahead of them and heading towards the English Channel. He doesn't even know how to get back to the ship, Duke had to laugh, jogging with Murray to catch up. What happened to those fine threads? Murray asked once they caught up to him. Narrow Bond spit in disdain. Do you even know where you're going? It doesn't matter. We need to leave before they find him. Find who? The Mughal diplomat. I could not kill him, so I left him tied up. When all those fine English gentlemen return, they will realize I'm only a dark-skinned imposter. Wait. You pretended to be a Mughal? You hate Indians! To an Englishman, we're all the same, Bond stated. Then he turned to confirm their mission. Legrand was right about Kidd. So we assumed. I've met our enemy, Bond added. I shook his hand. You shook his hand? Murray asked, raising an eyebrow. Narraband swallowed hard before explaining. The Tory ministers were behind Kidd's trial and conviction, but it was a Whig minister named Newton that allowed it to happen. He's the same man who hired Kidd 6 years ago. Murray shot Duke a concerned look. You met this man? Bond nodded. The man is a sorcerer, which is why we must leave before I tell you more about him. The Alchemist's Ring, Chapter 20. The Atlantic Ocean, aboard the Daphne, May 24th, 1701. The cold waters of the Atlantic soothed Drake Murray's nerves as he stood on the deck in the early morning hours. For the first time in 6 years, he'd returned home, yet the deck of a ship was his true home now. He watched the alien crew adjusting the rigging and course for the conditions of the new day. The return to the Caribbean would be a warmer path than had been their departure, following the Canary Current south to the Cape Verde Islands, and then riding the Equatorial Current west to the Caribbean. Even though he'd only recently boarded the Daphne, he knew it was a Caribbean pirate crew looking for French shipping vessels to hunt. In the coming days, as they passed by the coast of France, they were in the most danger from attack. But Archibald Varro knew when to attack and when to hide, especially when protecting precious cargo, 3 fugitive members of the Adventure prize. A sailor made a direct approach from the stern. Captain Varro wants to speak with you. Murray found himself in the shadow of Captain Vero's monstrous hag. The sailor's eyes tightened as the sight of her broad shoulders, lack of discernible breasts, and arms the size of small tree trunks, and her eyes tightened in awareness of Murray's judgment. 2 years ago, Legrand had put his fate and his plan and fate in the collection of bizarre outlaws, the Flying Sylphs. While all 4 captains were effective pirates, their reputation for carnal depravity isolated them even in the ranks of Nassau criminals. The Daphne, unlike most other crews, specialized in sunken treasure extraction, which meant any sailor who could swim and dive found a bit more money working for Captain Vero. Broad shoulders, thick arms. She's a champion swimmer, I'm sure. Murray was led from the prow all the way to the captain's quarters, where the scent of freshly made breakfast greeted him even before the door opened. Inside, Jimmy Duke and Nero Bond sat at the table with Captain Vero. "Have a seat, Mr. Murray." "Will, you too." The thick woman obliged the order. Of course, Will Thomas, first mate, short for Wilhelmina? Wilma? Captain Vero took a moment to join the table. As the ranking officer from the Adventure Prize, and out of respect for Captain Legrand, I wanted you to be present as Mr. Bond and I talked about the conspiracy surrounding the death of late Captain Kidd. He wants verification that the story is true. Very smart to learn this as we sail through French waters. If we are taken, Vero will have something worthy of trade. I want him to tell me about this sorcerer who betrayed Captain Kidd. Jimmy Duke snickered. Bond misspoke. The man is a scientist. Bond recoiled, the wrinkles in his dark brown conveying his agitated mood. I know the difference between a scientist and sorcerer. While you two were betting whores and drinking London Dry, I performed the duty tasked to me. The man is a sorcerer. Perhaps you misunderstood the word sorcerer, Murray offered. Why do you say sorcerer? Nero Bond sighed in frustration. The man of whom I speak, Minister Newton, is indeed a renowned scientist at one of England's finest colleges, but privately, he traffics in the occult and secret knowledge of the world. The item he pays the most for are ancient religious texts, especially those related to magnum opus. The great work? Murray translated the Latin. A sorcerer, Bond repeated. I don't know what magnum opus refers to, Captain Vero said. It is known as the Philosopher's Stone by some, and the Elixir of Life by others. By reputation, it can grant immortality, and in other tales, it can transform ordinary objects into gold. Please tell me this isn't a ruse from Captain Legrand to pay with items dipped in golden paint. If he tries to pay me with a bag of magical beans, the last thing any of you will see is Willow Thomas about to pluck out your eyes with a red-hot pincher. Willow, a woman built like a tree. Captain Kidd's treasure is real, and the second half of your payment will be the same value as you received to take us on as prisoners, Bond insisted. Legrand let Nero Bond lead the covert mission, sending Murray and Drake in support of the elderly navigator. Murray enjoyed a trip home to England, but his real home was on the sea, and despite his advancing age, he enjoyed the thrill of adventure as much as Duke. And surprisingly, Murray trusted Legrand more than he trusted other pirates, including Vero. The Flying Sylphs were enemies of the French government, despite their French ancestry, so alliances with English pirates suited them when needed. So this Newton fellow dabbles in black magic. So what? What does this have to do with Captain Kidd's death? Vero asked. Governor Bellamont hired Kidd to hunt down Long Ben Avery's pirate fleet, to bring them to justice, and also restore the name of the American colonies in the eyes of the Grand Mughal, Duke began. "And while our crew was at it, we were to sink and plunder any French ships. We expected to lie in wait for Avery's allies to return to the Caribbean, but instead, we were first sent to England." Murray continued, "It was there we received a brand new top-of-the-line ship, the Adventure Galley, and we were fitted with an English crew, all hired by Bellomont's investors." "Newton's men," Varro surmised. "From the very beginning, Kidd made a series of mistakes. Instead of saluting a naval yacht anchored at Greenwich, Kidd allowed his American crewmen to insult the royal vessel, resulting in us being fired upon and 10 random men detained, even though the newspapers write that Kidd committed piracy when he took the Quedagh Merchant as prize." "Another Mughal ship?" Murray nodded. "Yes, inflaming repaired relationships between England and India. The only crime Kidd truly committed was breaking the orders he'd been given by our phantom puppet master, this Newton fellow. Kidd's orders were clear: scout the Red Sea, the Horn of Africa, and the island of Madagascar, and in a year's time, report the comings and goings of pirate activity. For a while, he followed orders, but when he engaged Robert Culliford outside of Madagascar, he sealed his fate." Hearing the name Culliford twisted Murray's guts. As much as he wanted treasure, he wished also for revenge against the man who killed so many of his friends. "So it wasn't pirating of the Quedagh Merchant?" Captain Varro asked, "or the murder of a crewman? You're saying that he lost his life because he attacked an actual pirate, Culliford? That doesn't make any sense." Murray nodded in agreement. Newton wanted the element of surprise. "So he executed the man he'd hired?" Varro asked. This time, all eyes went to Narrowbon, who explained, "From halfway across the world, Isaac Newton ordered the captain's death because Kidd broke his trust. Kidd also knew too much. You see, despite Britain's bold talk against piracy, Newton has been holding back in dealing with his true enemies, which is why he issued a warrant for the disrespectful and disobedient Kidd. Legrand was right about this puppet master, and not only was Newton the one who betrayed Kidd, but he also is planning a major offensive in the days to come." "A major offensive? England is too preoccupied with its war against France to allocate any naval resources, which is why Newton is creating the Black Fleet." "The Black Fleet," Varro scoffed at Bond. "Newton is seeking pirate captains to do his dirty work. Before we received our commission, Captain Kidd attacked a French ship destined for Montreal. We killed every last man on that ship except for the giant we brought back to Newton. He's the warden of the Mint, and English gold can buy a lot of secrets." Captain Varro put his head in his hand for a few minutes and scratched his extravagant wig. He looked to Willow Thomas and rolled his eyes. Thomas only shrugged. "Explain to me what Legrand is doing in Canada if his quarrel is with this Newton fellow." "Before Legrand goes to war with a sorcerer, he has to prepare himself for battle." Chapter 21. Beaupré, Quebec, July 1701. The War of the Grand Alliance was fought between the years 1688 and 1697, and was considered the first global war. It began in England, where control of the British Empire fractionated between two claimants to the vacant throne. When King William emerged as the heir, war broke out throughout Europe as allies with the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch, Spain, Savoy, Portugal, and France witnessed mighty empires seeking to establish dominance in Europe and abroad. America was not spared by the conflict. Colonists in New France and New England immediately went to war with each other since control of the continent's vast resources was on the line. While the colonial war threatened the French presence in the Great Lakes region, especially Montreal, An international war erupted between Native American tribes. With the American colonists aligned with the Iroquois Confederacy, France turned to the tribes of the Great Lake region for alliances, the Huron, the Chippewa, and Illinois, to defend their interests. These nations, along with other smaller tribes, found themselves crushed in a vice between the mighty Iroquois in the east and the powerful Sioux west of the Mississippi. For a decade, it was a war of survival. Yet, in the summer of 1701, peace finally returned to the continent, and commerce again flourished, allowing a man like Dr. Thomas Barrow to visit without notice. Captain Legrand was right. The St. Lawrence Riverway is so busy, no one will have time to take notice of us, Thomas Barrow decided as the small sloop neared Montreal. He looked once more at the map, wishing he had Narrowbond to properly read it for him. After leaving behind Legrand at Anacostia Island, at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, Barrow traveled several hundred miles as the banks of the river grew tighter by the hour. Ahead, he saw a wall of green, as if the river somehow ended, but upon closer inspection of the map, he realized his part in the great game would soon begin. "We're approaching Orleans Island, Dr. Barrow," Athena McCormack said. Her smile unnerved him. Thomas Barrow was 35, handsome apart from his required spectacles, well-dressed, and totally terrified in the presence of the hired captain. Since his release from prison 6 years earlier, he'd seen all manners of horrors that stiffened his backbone. And he'd also served diabolical captains. But Captain Athena McCormack of the Flying Sylphs terrified him because she was a woman. "This is as far as I'll take you, Doctor. You'll have to get to Montreal all on your own. There are plenty of ships heading upriver. You could go into Quebec City and get a ride the rest of the way." "Passage has been arranged," Thomas said. "On the northern side of the island there is a small river along the shore. That is our destination." "You'll have to get there yourself. I'm not bringing the Eurydice into the Narrows. Even with our new rigging, there are ships coming and going that might recognize us. If I am discovered, I need room to blast my way out of this channel. Understood? No amount of promises from your sweet-talking Captain Legrand will let me endanger my crew. Agreed?" It flustered him that a woman gave commands. "We'll be back in less than a week. You have my word. Remember, Legrand will only pay you if you bring us back unharmed." "My loyalty to Legrand goes beyond money," McCormack insisted. "Now, go fetch your voodoo priest and be ready to embark. The sooner he's off my ship, the better." The Eurydice was the smallest ship amongst the Flying Sylphs, which was why Legrand had chosen Captain McCormack to take Barrow and Pierre Leduc back to New France. There were rumors that Legrand and McCormack were former lovers, but no one dared speak those rumors around McCormack, especially around her current lover, Captain Wart Jacobs, who stayed with Legrand back at Anacostia Island. Could she ever be interested in a man like me after loving Legrand? 2 hours later, Dr. Barrow found himself in a small rowboat as Pierre Leduc struggled against the currents of the St. Lawrence. Even though Narrowbond was the oldest member of Legrand's crew, Pierre Dulac had the longest tenure. The glares from the cook chilled Barrow, who kept his mouth shut as the rowboat angled toward the shore. The crew knew that along with being a culinary master, Leduc practiced a strange religion that could summon spirits to do his bidding. A man who'd complain about the food would die in his sleep or have a horrible accident, usually attributed to the glare of Dulac. Dulac steered the rowboat into the mouth of the Jean Larose River and slumped forward, exhausted. Barrow allowed him a few moments to rest before suggesting anything. According to the map, The plantation should be less than an hour's walk from here. Shall I fetch your bag, sir? The question followed a diabolical glint in his eyes. I'm sorry for making you do this, Thomas said. It wasn't my idea to involve you. Legrand hatched a good plan, and I will play the part of your servant. Do you really believe he was a French nobleman before he became a pirate? Thomas nodded. I've always been able to tell he was an educated man, but I assumed he was just a skilled liar. He always gave Captain Kidd shrewd counsel, but a spy? For a secret society? It sounds far-fetched. Yes, but he's been right about everything so far. We kept our mouths shut, and they arrested Captain Kidd, just like he said they would. They brought Kidd to trial in London, and his own Whig supporters turned on him, just like Legrand said they would. If Legrand really was a French lord, then why would he risk his life for stories about a treasure, unless the stories about treasure were true? I'm more worried about risking my own life. This plan will never work. If he really was a French lord and the treasures he told us about are true, what are we doing here in Quebec? It seems unnecessary. Despite being a foul man who hated most men, especially doctors, Dulac nevertheless worshipped Legrand and defended him as vigorously as the rest of the crew. Perhaps we don't need this fellow at all. Perhaps Legrand is testing us. If we manage to abduct this fella, we'll prove that we are worthy of a share of the treasure. Thomas pondered the thought. I've never thought of it like that. But if this man we're after used to be friends with Legrand, then why can't we just ask him nicely to come with us? Quit trying to outthink Legrand and just follow orders, Doctor. An hour later, the two stood at the stone gate to a large plantation. After failed attempts to get the attention of anyone within, the men lingered outside for a few moments. This is the place, isn't it? Dulac asked. Right down to the arrangement of farm buildings. Maybe we'll have to take McCormick's idea and secure a ride in town aboard a ship. Maybe the real owner's away. We're pressed for time the way it is, Barrow said. Let's find a low place and hop the fence. Your letter will explain the loss of a few horses. So they walked the perimeter until the stone fence dipped below the height of a man's head. Dulac set the bags on top of the wall, and the two found footholds and climbed up and over the fence. They walked over an untended field, which had once been set up to grow food to feed a small village. Even the farm buildings held the capacity to grow livestock to feed a small army. Yet, only a few dozen chickens roamed the yards. Hello! Dr. Barrow shouted. Is anyone home? A disheveled man came bursting from the front door with a musket and a white shirt in hands. Not another step. I have letters of introduction, Barrow shouted. We are friends of the owner. I'm the owner of this plantation. According to these letters, your name is Abraham Leyret, a farm manager from Mont de Marsan. Are you indeed Leyret? Who are you? I am Dr. Thomas Barrow, a friend of Louis Armand, Barrow said, waving the letter. The Baron is living in Holland. I only manage the farm while he's away. How do I know you are his friends? Thomas had been given enough evidence to convince Leyret, and for the next 2 hours, the men took turns investigating the double lives of Louis Armand Guerin as Baron and Captain. Everything Captain Legrand had said about his time in New France was validated by the servant, and in turn, they gave his former servant enough details about the man that both sides were convinced they knew the same man. So Baron Lahontan is alive, Leyret summarized at the conclusion of the tale, and living in London. The letter was a lie, meant to spread disinformation in New France. Yes, with the War of the Grand Alliance ending, the local aggressions ending here in New France, Your baron thought it was best to reveal himself to you. When he learned we were traveling to Montreal, he insisted on sending us with this letter. We heard he was killed by English pirates off the coast of Maine, Leyret said. After 9 years, I feared he was dead. I assumed if the government ever arrested him, someone would come to claim the farm. Until then, I kept running things just to keep myself alive. We are not here to claim the farm. After a brief rest, we'll continue to Montreal and be on our way with haste. Of course, it is an honor to host friends of the Baron. The estate is yours while you are visiting. What do you need? A fresh corpse would be helpful, Barrow mused. I'll need to borrow a team of horses and a carriage, Barrow said. And some ink, Dulac added, winking mischievously at Barrett. Chapter 22. Montreal, Quebec, August 4th, 1701. For the first time in his life, Pierre Dulac did not feel as if the color of his skin mattered. He found a place upon the hill and watched the inspiring sight unfolding in the valley below. Even without Dr. Barrow, he understood well enough what was happening. The French government presented themselves first, with delegations from King Louis's court, the local French governor, and the local leaders of Montreal. Next, a strange silence came over the valley as the enemies presented themselves alongside their French hosts. A delegation from London and from the American colonies represented the English interests in North America. For that matter, Dulac also recognized foreigners from the Netherlands, Hesse, Spain, and Portugal watching the ceremony as well, dreaming of ways to make more money. With the Americans came a coalition of their Indian allies, the Iroquois. The fiercest of the Native American tribes in the East, the Iroquois had fought side by side with the British and American leaders to attempt to seize the wealth of the Great Lakes. Prior to the War of the Grand Alliance, the Iroquois had defeated and uprooted countless tribes for their English-speaking partners, bringing chaos and bloodshed to the frontier. The reason for the peace treaty became clear, for while the delegation of Iroquois stood tall and fearless, they were dwarfed by the rest of the delegation that stood with France. Even if he hadn't heard the number, Dulac's eyes could have counted the remaining delegations in the valley below, with each nation clustered together in the massive field. 39 Indian nations stood together in opposition to the Iroquois, forcing the bully to the table 4 years after England and France ceased hostilities. From what Dulac heard, over 1,300 delegates descended upon Montreal to deal with the Iroquois threat. Following the Iroquois, a coalition of Indians approached, wearing black jackets with red cuffs and bright red pants with colorful blue turquoise up and down the sides of their legs and upon their arms and shoulders. A strange mixture of European metals, as well as feathers, beads, and ornate necklaces, covered the most regal of delegations as they approached the other three players in the drama. A few feet from where Dulac sat, a group of Jesuits were commenting on the arrival. From what Legrand told them, the Jesuits were rivals, but not enemies. They knew about one of the treasures, the one out on the frontier, and for this reason, Legrand could come no closer to New France than Anacostia Island, or risk being recognized and arrested. Instead of recoiling at his presence, the Jesuits hardly took notice of him as he moved closer to join their conversation. "Who are those fellows?" he asked the priest. "They are the Petun, the people of the hills," one of the priests said, as if he understood. Another priest caught his eyes and explained further. "They are the leaders of the Huron Confederacy. If you were to meet one up close, you'd notice how they tattoo their bodies. While the Petun are a small tribe, They rallied the disjointed nations fleeing west to stop and make a stand against the Iroquois nation. If not for them, we'd be sitting in the newest colony of England right now. You don't say. Dulac raised his eyebrow and shrugged. See, Dr. Barrow? Legrand has thought of everything, including the need for ink. Even a few hundred yards away, Dulac could see the ink upon the cheeks and chins of the ornate men, and all across the valley, their allies whispered upon their approach. So the fella with a felt hat stuffed with feathers, the one holding the big peace pipe, is he the big chief then? Legrand's old friend. The priest shook his head in disbelief. Big chief? The man you speak of is the greatest tactician upon the continent, and perhaps its greatest man. No Indian has ever possessed greater merit, a finer mind, more valor, prudence, or discernment in understanding those whom he had to deal. Another priest quickly added, He's a devout Christian also. Took the holy sacraments when he was a young man, and has been a champion of the faith ever since. Upon his lands, the French will build Fort Detroit. He is the rat, Kondiaronk. They worship him, Dulac thought to himself, keeping his reaction private. He felt the hairs on his neck stand on end and looked desperately for a sign of Dr. Barrow. What have we agreed to? Legrand should have sent me to watch Captain Kidd die. For a few moments, it felt as if a great spotlight had been aimed upon his spot on the hill, and the great mob sharpened their knives to descend upon him. Dulac took a few controlled breaths as he watched the Huron Confederacy join the negotiation table. Is this the same man known as Gaspar? 3 of the priests shot him a dirty look, but the 4th grinned. I would not use that name. Despite his age, Kondiaronk is still a powerful warrior, and that name is reserved for only those who he considers his friends. A great warrior, huh? He stood side by side with Governor Frontenac during the war. New France was outmanned by New England 10-1, but again and again, Kondiaronk stole victory from the aggressors. His confederacy has brought the Iroquois to the knees. This is a great day for New France. And the worst day of my life. I am about to be torn to pieces by an angry mob. Governor Calieri opened the ceremony with a long oration in French, while an English translator echoed his words for those gathered at the stage. Dulac only caught bits and phrases, and, like many on the high hill, took in only the visual spectacle of it. So, all of these other tribes have just come to watch the Iroquois lay down their arms? Dulac asked as he saw leaders of the Haudenosaunee perform a condolence ceremony by exchanging gifts with the Huron Confederacy. At first, a priest said, but when they heard both England and France had come to Montreal to sign treaties, and that Kondiaronk represented the Huron, they flooded Montreal to join. If there is to be war in the New World again, England will face a united coalition of Indian tribes west of the Alleghenies. The Illinois, Kickapoo, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, Abnaki, Miami, and even the vile Fox have come to be part of Kondiaronk's treaty. When the Iroquois learned the mighty Anishinaabe nations agreed to pledge to France, they had no choice. One man's effort brought this global war to a sudden conclusion, another priest added. Governor Calieri finished, and Kondiaronk stepped into the vacated place. To Dulac's surprise, the gray-haired statesman opened in English, then spoke to the Iroquois, then continued his speech in French. During the oration, Kondiaronk shook his fists, and his bright red cuffs brought another level of intensity. Sensing the inspiration felt in the lower parts of the valley and watching the pockets of the native tribes collapse to get a better spot to hear the man speak, Dulac almost rose to join them, but one figure moved opposite of the crowd, the doctor. As he passed, he glanced from time to time back to the stage, but for the most part, he watched his toes until he stood beside Dulac. He even walks like a snake. "What took you so long?" Dr. Barrow noticed the nearby Jesuit priests and lowered his voice. "After I introduced myself to Gaspar, he pressed me for quite a while, but finally I was able to have a few moments alone with him to offer him Legrand's gift." "Did he accept it?" "Yes, but he insisted we drink it together, to the health of our shared friend," Barrow said. "So after I left him, I forced myself to retch it all up, and I took a tincture of Calabar bean to offset the effects. So I think I'd like to just sit here with you for a few hours. Don't let me fall asleep, whatever you do." "Then you delivered the gift." "Delivering a speech to a crowd this size will certainly accelerate a person's heart rate. My guess is that he'll be dead by nightfall." "We should run while we have the chance," Dulac thought. But as he watched Kondiaronk unite a continent, he knew why Legrand sent them. Chapter 23. Montreal, New France, August 4th, 1701. "The mad dog has been let off his leash," Dr. Thomas Barrow thought as he rested on his elbows in the hot sun. "Is it hot or am I dying?" He took careful measure of his own heart rate and rinsed his throat with water 3 more times as the internal clock inside of his head ticked forward. While Dulac was fetching him some water, he even struck up a conversation with the Jesuit priests, which caused him to fester in the still moments until the Haitian arrived. "If the conspiracy is discovered, at least I will not be thrown into a prison. I'll be torn to pieces by the mob surrounding me." He'd faced another mob back in Cambridge when the entire medical department turned on him, condemning him for his private anatomical studies and the illegal procurement of corpses. While Barrow believed he'd committed only clerical mistakes in the registration, the ambitious men in his department rallied against him, resulting in a 5-year prison sentence. After Barrow served with his 2 friends, a friend of his professor, a professor at Cambridge, helped secure his early release. His penance and freedom meant he'd be a surgeon on a new warship, the Adventure Galley, which would be departing London to hunt pirates in the Caribbean Sea and Indian Ocean. After the arrest of Captain Kidd, Barrow told the crew that it had been Isaac Newton who arranged for his position of surgeon to be restored, on a ship he'd built for a specific purpose. The crew of the Adventure Galley openly despised Kidd, but they loved their first mate Legrand, and after helping him to survive Culliford, they left William Kidd to his fate. "If we can slow down the French along the Mississippi River," Legrand told his crew 2 years ago, "then we'll rob King Louis of his most precious gem. To do this, however, I'll need some help. One ship can't do it alone. I need Gaspar." Still feeling the effects of the atropa belladonna mixed with laudanum, Thomas had to steady his heart as he saw a platoon warrior running up the hill toward him. A single runner means this plan might actually work. Thomas remained still under the umbrella until the man stopped. "We need a doctor. Chief Kondiaronk has fallen ill," the young man said loudly and desperately. A wave of concern came over those listening within range, and Barrow mirrored concern. "Ill?" Thomas said, and looked to Dulac to help sell the lie. "I just saw him speaking a few hours ago." He began coughing, and his throat constricted, and suddenly he collapsed. "Are you a doctor?" For 2 days, Barrow had loudly declared his title to everyone he met, including men from the Huron Confederacy. Yes, of course." Thomas jumped up, grabbing his travel bag and medical satchel. After a few steps, he stopped. "One moment. Pierre, go bring the wagon down to Kondiarank's tent in case I need certain supplies." "Of course, Dr. Barrow," Dulac said, blinking incredulously at the unfolding and imminent abduction. "I've known brilliant men in my life, but Legrand is the only genius I've met," Barrow thought as he jogged through the curious crowd. At the stage, lesser chiefs continued to sign the document as raised voices began to sound the crowd. "I feel like Daniel entering the lion's den," he thought as he passed through a mass of 100 concerned Huron warriors. Earlier that morning, he'd met many of them, but he'd privately met with Gaspar, so no one saw the men share the special vintage of wine gifted by Baron Lahontan. When the effects of the nightshade took hold, the constricted throat made most men mute to any tales. Approaching the tent, the door flap was being held open by one of the black and red leaders of the Huron Confederacy, allowing Barrow to see men, including another doctor, gathered around a bed. Damn it all, where did he come from? "He has a high fever," the other doctor said with panic in his eyes. "Thomas Barrow," he said, extending his hand for a quick handshake. "André Saleri," he said. "These men shouted for a doctor, but I'm only a surgeon's assistant. I don't know how to treat him." "I can't have him here. He'll see what we're doing, or..." So Thomas pulled rank. "Don't worry. I was trained at Cambridge in pharmaceutical arts and anatomy. I'll take responsibility for this patient. Before you go, could you go find my slave? He's bringing around my medical wagon, but I'm afraid he might get lost in all the confusion." "Of course, Dr. Barrow, of course," O'Leary said, withdrawing from the tent. "Okay, I got rid of him. Now I need to get rid of the others." Thomas earnestly checked Gaspar's vitals, measuring the effects of the poison he had administered a few hours earlier. He fed the onlookers a healthy dose of negative nonverbals, and even bursts of frustrations, barking out requests until both Leduc and O'Leary returned. At that point, it became easy to remove onlookers from the tent and close it for privacy. Legrand had given them the pretense for privacy. "I worry he has Dutch influenza," Barrow said loudly to Alieri. "His fever is aggravating the lining of his lungs, which is why he lost consciousness so quickly. He's drowning on his own fluids." The Dutch influenza?" O'Leary asked, losing interest in helping. "Before I left England, we'd just heard of its sudden and terrible effects. With so many folks attending the signing at the peace treaty, I'm afraid to tell his friends that he has contracted. I will do my best." "Can he be saved? Kondiaronk is an important man." Thomas shook his head. "First, we need to lower the fever. Fetch ice and thick blankets. We'll wrap him to slow the progression." Alieri nodded and burst into the crowd, barking out requests. While the Huron men scrambled, Barrow could hear concerned voices. News of an influenza outbreak spread fear through the crowd. He looked over at Dulac and nodded confidently. "Is the wagon ready?" "I pulled it right up to the back of the tent as you wanted." "Good. Now start hauling in the ice. That will get their attention. Have them clear away from the door, too, for their own good." For effect, Thomas wore the long black gloves, the heavy black apron, and even a face shield to do battle with the Dutch influenza. When O'Leary returned, Thomas heightened the tension by saying softly, "If this is Dutch influenza, the whole crowd assembled here is in danger. I can tend to Kondiaronk, but I need your help getting these people to a safe distance." "I understand." By early evening, all of Barrow's requests had been met, and the tent was lit by lamplight. This added to the tensions in the waiting men, and the sound of weeping began to be heard. It was then his time upon the stage began. As a boy, Thomas had starred starred in a production of Romeo and Juliet. So he found a bit of perverse pleasure in the quality of his performance. As he'd done every few minutes for the past hours, he took measurements of Gaspar's vitals. A cold and drowsy humor. He took Gaspar's temperature. No pulse shall keep his native progress. He took the chief by the wrist, and after shaking his head in frustration, he repositioned to put his finger to the jugular vein. No warmth, no breath shall testify thou livest. He tore away the cold blankets and placed his ear upon Gaspar's chest. The roses in thy lips and cheeks shall fade. To pale ashes thy eyes' windows fall. Oh no, Barrow said, and collapsed upon Gaspar's chest. No. Dulac jumped up. What's wrong? A platoon relative rushed over to the bed. The man gasped and draped himself over the body of the fallen chief, cold to the touch and without breath or pulse. We must tell the others, Dulac said to the teary-eyed warrior beside him. Together we must tell them that he is dead. Holding the platoon man by the shoulders, they rose, and upon emerging from the tent, he altered the plan. For weeks he'd thought of what he would say, but now all he could do is say, Condillac has died. May flights of angels win him to his rest. A groan filled the crowd, and it doubled once the platoon man shared the news in his own language. With night upon them, the crowd drifted away in tears. Finally, only the platoon delegation returned. Two men went bursting into the tent to confirm it, causing him to call out, His body is still infected. It isn't safe for you to touch him. Dulac immediately began to wipe the arms and hands of the men, leading them outside. I will have my man clean and prepare the body, but make sure none of the men touch him. It isn't safe. For the better part of an hour, Barrow stood with the men as they grieved. I am sorry I could not have done more, he insisted to them. And now for the final act. As the grieving subsided, Barrow committed to the most dangerous part of the plan. I must collect my belongings and go. He stood there, waiting at the door flap for a few moments, offering one more condolence. With a dismissive nod, he entered the tent, only to discover Dulac and the body of Condillac already absent. A moment later, the rear of the tent lifted, and Dulac crawled through backwards, dragging the body of a dead man. The skin was pale and the ink fresh, but the doppelganger would likely work, especially after placing the corpse upon the bed and hastily replacing the linen and clothing. I'm shaking with fear, Dulac admitted softly. Stand outside as I wrap the body in linen. Tell them I do this for their own safety. Is that understood? Thomas quickly wrapped the doppelganger. Once wrapped, the hoax would be complete. Even if a relative demanded to see the body, the poor lighting and tattoos would sell the trick. Carrying the lantern from the tent left it in complete darkness, and already many of the platoon who'd lingered for hours outside the tent had gone. Thomas removed his plague mask and began tossing his large gloves into the fire. I've wrapped his body for protection from the Dutch influenza, but you must take all precaution when handling the body, that you do not touch his flesh. He and Dulac walked around the tent, climbed up in their wagon, quietly pulled away. Dulac found the path through the valley that led to the main road leading back to Montreal, even though they had no intention of returning to their hotel. At dawn, the platoon would likely begin preparing a funeral for the legendary chief. If any of them inspected the corpse closely, they'd discover a 59-year-old Micmac man marked with platoon tattoos. Even so, Barrow wanted to be hours from Montreal and on his way to Beaupré. Who would risk their life to do such a thing? Obey my orders. Leave him wrapped." "Did you bind him well?" Barrow asked. "The antidote should begin working within an hour or two." "Yes, and I wrapped him in warm blankets to take away his chill," Dulac said. "Legrand had better be right about this treasure of his. I'm beginning to think we should have negotiated better." Barrow glanced at the still but living body. "Gaspar, a great and noble friend. I hope this ruse is worth it in the end." Chapter 24, Anticosti Island, August 1701. Louis Armand Guerin watched the deep pool for several minutes, confirming the location of his prey. 3 beautiful trout emerged from the depths. He ignored the discomfort in his cold, wet legs, silenced the sounds of the wilderness surrounding the isolated lake, and dismissed the birds reflecting on the still surface. He prayed earnestly, even if he didn't know what to ask the Lord. "Be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Which one do I choose?" Just like with the 3 trout, Louis Armand had 3 personas he could claim. The shallow trout. As Baron Lahontan, he'd both saved and destroyed New France. In 1688, he personally unleashed chaos and began a war on the frontier. After maneuvering into a position of command as Captain d'Arcy of the Lahontan Marines, he burned French outposts, ignored military orders, and abandoned his post to go with his friend and ally deep into hostile Sioux territory to verify the location of the Philosopher's Stone at a place called the Haunted Valley. Unable to acquire the treasure, he antagonized the mighty 7 council fires, known to the French as the Sioux, who then went on to war and push back every fur trader and tribe all the way to the forts of Montreal. He returned to Montreal just in time to save it from the English, becoming a hero and celebrity during the War of the Grand Alliance. But he barely fled the continent before his deeds were discovered by his enemies, the Order of the Ios and the Jesuits. "Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." The wild trout? Hadn't he earned a wicked life after giving a decade of his life to the role of Baron Lahontan? Living his days as the pirate Gareth Legrand could be fun and profitable. The periphery, and the world, all but assumed Baron Lahontan was dead, so it'd be easy to let it remain that way. With Captain Kidd killed by his own master, Gareth Legrand could take the ship to any of the 7 seas and live a free life. "For we wrestle not against the flesh and blood, but against the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." The large trout? Lurking in the depths, Louis Armand Guerin waited to fulfill his purpose. He joined the periphery as a young man, and they'd sent him to America to thwart the plans of the Priory of Ormus, the Order of Eos, and even the Society of Jesuits. At his discretion. So, at the first opportunity, he went to see if the ancient tales of the elixir of life, the legendary Philosopher's Stone, were true. Keys to unlocking the larger puzzle, however, appeared during his encounter with Benjamin Horne in the Quai Merchant. He and Chief Gaspar stood upon the soil of an ancient kingdom ruled by an ancient king, but lacked a full understanding of what to do with that knowledge. Now, the answer to his prayers were in reach, if he had the courage to chase after them. An hour later, he emerged from the pool with 3 trout tied to his belt, and crossed through the rocky stream until he stood at the shore of the Atlantic. He packed up his borrowed gear and threw the 3 trout over his shoulder as he walked back to the village at Port Minier. He had enjoyed his stay at the island, and the solitude gave him time to think. Take unto you the whole armor of God. He thought of Jimmy Duke, Narrowbond, and Drake Murray, returning from England. the helmet of salvation. He thought of his sailing master and carpenter waiting on Tortuga Island, the shield of faith. He thought of Barrow and Dulac's audacious mission to Montreal, the breastplate of righteousness. Fate had blown his friends to the four winds, and soon he'd find out how the leaves settled. But am I a madman driven by ego, or am I indeed the sword of the Spirit? His ears caught the foreign sound in the forests of Anacostia Island, the flap of sails. Situated in the middle of the Gulf of the St. Lawrence River, Anacostia Island stretched 135 miles from tip to tip and was filled with thick forests, dozens of rivers, and a dangerous population of bears. Yet the rocky shores and submerged bars caused enough shipwrecks to keep the island free of settlements, except for the 4 homes built by the Joliet family. The Joliet family were allies of the periphery and victims in the game, with their father vanishing from the face of the earth a short time earlier. With a treasure chest of loot and a weak explanation, Louis Armand had been their guest for most of the summer. Will it be doom or good news? Knowing the approach into the narrow channel of the bay would take a skilled captain, he did not rush returning back to the bay. When the sails came into view, his heart sank, but just for a moment until he remembered the ship had re-rigged to hide its identity. Captain Vincent Galloway's 32-gun sloop, the Malay, quietly drifted into the bay, transitioning from sail to oar to navigate the tricky shoals. Behind it, he saw the Eurydice following it. They did it. Those 2 madmen did it. Now, Guerin hastened his pace, if only to keep the Joliet family from becoming alarmed. Jacques Joliet, the eldest son, stood with his 3 young sons. All 4 were armed and ready. Deeper in the bay, Nicholas Joliet stood with his rifle also. At the center of the bay, Therese Galliot stood with her mother and husband at the main house. When they saw Guerin approaching from the woods, they remained steadfast. It's okay. They are friends. While he waited for his pawns to complete their moves, he wrote a fictitious narrative of a baron and his noble Indian guide and their travels deep into the frontier. A bluff, a lie, a distraction for my enemies. Why choose Lahontan, Legrand, or Guerin when I continue to play the game as all 3 roles? Now he returned to the Joliet compound where he'd written the tale. Boats were being lowered from the 2 ships. Is it a good sign? Jacques Joliet asked him, or is it trouble? Those are the 2 ships I sent to Montreal, which is a very good sign. But until Captain Jacobs arrives, the future is unsettled. The one anchored on the southern end of the island? Yes, we'll need all 3 ships for this endeavor to succeed. Mrs. Joliet, could I trouble you for a final meal before I depart? The ship from Montreal meant the acquisition of an important ally. Unless I'm mistaken, we have a funeral and a birth to celebrate today. When the 2 rowboats came ashore, Guerin recognized each person. Captain Vincent Galloway and his navigator came on the first boat. Athena McCormack, Dr. Barrow, and Pierre Dulac came from the Eurydice with a familiar 4th figure, Gaspar. Ah, my old friend lives, which means the real man has died and the fictional man is about to be born. With the Joliet men greeting the 2 rowboats, Guerin took a moment to jog up onto a rocky bluff. In the distance, he saw sails cutting through the thin trees of the southern horizon. Captain Jacobs has proven his friendship. The Phoebe joined the small fleet in the bay, and Guerin watched it all from the stony peak. Jacobs came ashore with his navigator after having spent the summer hunting and fishing the southern parts of the island. If spooked by warships, Jacobs would have bolted back into the Caribbean. But he stayed. My suit of armor is almost complete. With all 3 captains assembled in Claire Joliet's home and no foul play visible, Luis Armand descended from his perch to deal with his first crime against humanity. Knowing members of his crew, as well as the 3 captains from the Flying Sylphs, would be present in the main house, he donned the gear before befitting his new captaincy. To distinguish himself from English and British captains, he wore green and gold, from his wide-brimmed hat to his bone-buttoned jacket. For the flash and fashion, his cravat and waist sash were also gold. Knowing he was a short man, his hat plumes would have been the envy of a Sioux chieftain. The folds from his jacket concealed a cutlass, rapier, and a leather baldric that held 4 holsters for 4 flintlock pistols. His black boots hid 2 daggers. His favorite accessory was the eye patch, with a ruby eye sewn into the fabric where the eyeball should have been. Although he lost the eyeball to Culliford's blade, he gained the loyalty of the adventure prize. The other officers, the men he now saw as friends, hid the truth from Kidd when Culliford released him. Now, pausing at the back door, Garin listened to the dinner happening at the Joliet table, and threw the door open, letting his boots silence the room. Losing his eye gave him a new sense of being a true pirate. One day, I'll get revenge for my eye, and also give the Baron a proper ending. But now, I serve more important matters. Chief Gaspar sat at the table between Dr. Barrow and Pierre Dulac, with Captains Galloway, McCormick, and Jacobs on the other bench. The Joliet men sat at the ends of the table. Garin walked up to the head of the table and stood beside his host and stared at his old friend. "Behold, gentlemen, our belt of truth. This old native sitting in front of you has spent his life standing in the way of mighty nations to protect his people. The old muskrat, as his enemies called him, was a legend upon the frontier, and perhaps the smartest man I've ever known. I once helped him get vengeance upon his enemies, and now he will return the favor." "Baron Lahotton?" "In the flesh and bone. But I've not been Baron Lahotton for many years now. As far as the world knows, the fugitive Louis de l'Homme d'Arcy, Baron of Lahotton, is hiding somewhere in Holland or England. Since we've parted, I've become Captain Gareth Legrand, Scourge of the Seven Seas. Now you will repay the promise to me, but not as Condiaronk, or even Gaspar, who is buried in Montreal. I was born Louis Armand Garin, then became Baron Lahotton, and to survive, I became the pirate Gareth Legrand. So I've written you a new story, a new identity, and a new name. In this new life, you will be a Dario, a living figment of my imagination. Do I have plans for you?" Chapter 25, Anticosti Island, 1701. Gaspar listened as Louis Armand Garin tried to convince him of the convoluted logic of the plan. He let the Frenchman go on and on for hours as they sat in front of the Joliet fire. The truth. Baron Lahotton's biographical account would be published shortly in New Voyages to North America and chronicle his early days in New France, from his youthful days of hunting and trapping, then to the later years of fighting the Iroquois, and finally to an account of how fate led him to his position at Mackinac Island. The opportunity. The role of a Dario, the fictionalized sidekick of Baron Lahotton, would serve as a juxtaposition of cultures. Playing the part of the noble savage, a Dario's philosophical nature would question institutional Christianity, especially the Jesuit order and their dealings with the indigenous tribes. Call it theological revenge, Garin mused. The lie. A completely false account of their journey to the Haunted Valley in the heart of the Sioux territory was purported. Instead of describing the real Seven Council Fires, or the Land of the Blue Woman, a false narrative with false tribes and false rivers would be included in the soon-to-be-published book. It'll take them decades to figure out where the blue earth is located. Gaspar added a log to the fire. I'm not angry at you. After all, I no longer have any family or loved ones to watch over. But why did you need to lie about my death? If you'd sent for me, I would have come. Instead, you killed me. For the next stage of my plan, I needed a military tactician and also a diplomat. I didn't have time to wait for you to agree. If anyone saw you leaving in anything other than a coffin, there'd be too many questions asked. Since I've been away, I've learned much more about the legend of the Philosopher's Stone. In fact, I've encountered two men with knowledge about Marek and the Solomon's Ring. Do you remember talking about this ring during our visit to Oak Island? Gaspar nodded. When you spoke to me about trusting in the Creator, I didn't understand, but now I do. He put these two men in my path. He connected my right hand and my left hand. And at the same time my manuscript is confusing our enemies, we will be stealing the Philosopher's Stone out from under their noses. Lahan smiled proudly. I honestly never expected to see you again, Gaspar admitted. But the Lord did see fit to place answers in front of you. Did you discover what your masters will do if you indeed recover the lost stone? I've been back and forth across the globe, yet I haven't had an opportunity to return to Rome yet. I suppose I must inform them of what I've found in case something goes afoul. Another reason for your abduction is that you know the location of the Haunted Valley. You are an ally and a safeguard in case things go awry. This gives us an advantage over our enemies. He doesn't know. Oh, why do you think Eos searches for these relics? Doesn't matter. I just need to keep them from acquiring the Philosopher's Stone. The rest, as you put it, I'll leave in God's hands. So you acquired a ship and a crew, and you plan to obtain the Philosopher's Stone by stealth? A bit convoluted, yes. He needs to know. How do I tell him? What is it, Gaspar? What do you need to tell me? While you were gone, Montreal heard rumors about the fate of Pierre-Charles Lesueur. Yes, of course they did. I know all about Lesueur. You do. Yes, the Lord put him on my path. When I still served Captain Kidd, and he still served Isaac Newton, we were given a mission to acquire a French nobleman sailing to the New World. Of course, I had no idea it was my old nemesis. I only managed to witness him from a distance before a cannon blast almost claimed my life. Captain Kidd delivered him to Isaac Newton, and I can only imagine that poor Lesueur lived out the rest of his life in great discomfort in the Tower of London. Gaspar shook his head. When the War of the Grand Alliance ended, Lesueur was released. He was. So time will be of the essence. It's unlikely the Sioux will let any Frenchman anywhere near their lands for years to come, especially now that your Treaty of Montreal has ended Iroquois hostility. I did not defeat the Iroquois or the English. I only managed to find a way for my people to survive. The English pressured the proud Iroquois to sign, all the while knowing what? Lesueur has beaten you at your own game. The Bear Man? That big hairy ogre? How has he beaten me at my own game? After he was released from prison, he returned to France, received a new ship, a new crew, and a fully funded mining expedition. And he joined his Lemoyne kin at the mouth of the Mississippi. The mouth of the Mississippi? Lahan repeated, suddenly realizing where the story was about to lead. The news only reached Montreal a short while ago. Apparently, LeSueur traveled up the Mississippi with his team of soldiers and miners, snuck behind the Sioux, who were guarding the edges of the frontier far to the east, and in the span of several months, not only built a fort, but also managed to mine several tons of copper in the process. Copper? That means LeSueur has the Philosopher's Stone? Gaspar nodded solemnly. I know the fort has been destroyed, but the Sioux have not lashed out like they did when you and I journeyed to Makato. If LeSueur had stolen something from them, they showed no indication of following him either south into Illinois territory or east towards the Great Lakes. Their silence is most curious, but the news of LeSueur traveling with the barges certainly means he found something, doesn't it? I've waited too long. If I'd known he'd been released from his imprisonment, I wouldn't have... No, you're right. Something smells funny. The man who held him prisoner, my nemesis, Newton, would not have trusted an Eos ally to return to the frontier with the ability to betray. Why would he release him? Newton supplied the miners, Gaspar had answered. All he needed was the location, which only you, LeSueur, and I knew. Releasing LeSueur meant a chance at finding the treasure. Killing LeSueur meant the search needed to begin anew in hostile Sioux territory, Gaspar explained. So he either bought LeSueur, which is doubtful, or our old friend assumed he would be able to obtain the prize once it was found? You say LeSueur himself returned with the barges. He would not have returned unless he'd found it, Gaspar surmised. If he did find it, what would happen next? Duty would force him to transfer his prize back to his benefactor. He couldn't sail a French ship into London. He'd have to return to La Rochelle with it. That is where we'll find our answers, one way or another. So your plans for me on the Mississippi River have turned to ash? Gaspar asked. Garen ignored him, pondering the new facts for several moments. Even though my plans have changed, my uses for you have not. If our enemies learn that the Philosopher's Stone rested at Mikado, then they'll certainly not stop chasing the legend down the dark hole. Since we've parted, I've learned they are after much more than just the stone. Finding the stone was only the first step. You know LeSueur better than I. Would he give the Philosopher's Stone to either of our enemies? No. Why not? Love. He is a man of honor. Will do everything in his power to protect those he loves. His pretty little wife in Montreal? Garen scoffed. She's a Lemoyne. No. His true love is the slave Winona. Oh, yes, Legrand muttered. Then he'll hold me personally responsible for what happened between them. If he indeed found Winona's white egg at Mikado, his choice will be to protect her. A romantic? I would not have guessed. Well, even if all is lost, which you do not believe is the case, our enemies will discover the Philosopher's Stone is only a single key. Since we parted, my friend, I've learned that there's more than one way to pick a lock. Chapter 26. Ormond House, London, winter, 1701. With his day finished at the Royal Mint, Isaac Newton prepared for his ride home. He gathered up his belongings, collected a few of his notebooks, and inspected the room a final time before turning to depart. As Master of the Mint, he was given a carriage to bring home, which allowed him to transition to his private affairs. The route could be distracting. Much of it followed the northern banks of the Thames, with glimpses of history along the way, such as the London Bridge. After several years of the same 3-mile journey, it had all become mental wallpaper, though, and only the most subtle changes would catch his eye. Today, he anxiously anticipated a briefing 3 days in the making. His personal companion, Bernard Clerval, had been gone for 2 days on errands. With his pending return home, the next stage of the game would be revealed. Despite the influx of wealth after his appointment as Warden of the Mint, and 2 years ago as Master of the Mint, Newton used his money to buy influence instead of luxury. He rented a 3-story apartment with no grand views other than the other side of the street. It was a far cry from his childhood home in Woolsthorpe or his regal residences in Cambridge, but it was situated in the heart of the city. Almost hidden by a tailor shop, the front door to his residence was a 9-foot wooden door with a greeting area. He had a small garage behind the greeting area, which he filled with crates from Cambridge since the Royal Mint took care of his transportation. Upon closing the big door, his 2 servants quickly descended the stairs. "Mr. Clerval has returned," his housekeeper began. "I've set up his room and given him freshly laundered clothes. Do you have any requests?" "We might be traveling after supper concludes. Find my winter coat and have it ready. Make sure I have a coach ready at 8 o'clock that can take me to Westminster." His cook spoke next. "Supper is almost ready. Do you have any special requests to celebrate the return of Mr. Clerval?" "Just give him what he asks for. I'm sure he's earned it." Newton took a few minutes to freshen up and change clothes before he joined Bernard at the large dining room table on the 2nd floor. "How are the arrangements?" Bernard raised an eyebrow. "Everyone has been briefed, and their needs have been met. It's strange how the most savage have the simplest needs, yet the simple ones are so needy." "I'm sure you did all there was that was needed. What about the ships?" Clerval took a deep breath as if he was about to dive. "All 8 ships are ready for their captains. We're not going to be able to launch them all at the same time and have them sail by in formation, but they'll all be ready within the month for departure." He paused as if he needed to answer more, but waited to be prompted. "All this is good news, yet you seem a tad dour. What have you learned, Bernard?" "Unsettling news." "Do tell." "It was an unsolicited account from our youngest captain, the one out of Nassau." "Edward Drummond," Newton commented, knowing the names of the 8 captains as well as the 20 who had been rejected. "While meeting with him, I pressed him for tales of the Caribbean, just to make small talk. I asked him about the slave trade, the various islands, the end of hostilities between nations. He wondered if the end of the war meant anything to the Caribbean pirates, and upon further questioning, he told me about the sinking of a French merchant vessel off the shores of Bermuda. While the crew was rescued, the ship was lost. The ship came from a fort in the newly established Louisiana territory, and the cargo was well guarded until it sank to the bottom of the ocean. Just say it. It was bearing Pierre Charles Lesueur." Newton had to force himself to swallow the bile building in his throat. "Did Lesueur survive?" "He did, and despite losing the ship and the cargo, he brought several chained prisoners back to France with him." back to Lahulier and the Order of Eos. So, were we betrayed? What about our embedded spies? Mr. Drummond did not witness the sinking of the ship, but he did say the crew claimed there was an explosion, and that the ship sank suddenly. A bluff? Or is the Philosopher's Stone at the bottom of the Atlantic? Do you think our prize is at the bottom of the Atlantic? If the tale was true, it is a most unfortunate turn of events. However, the prisoners. Why would LeSueur save his prisoners? Knowing what we know, LeSueur would have some explaining to do, especially if he found something. He must have fought his way through the trap we set, and if he did secure the Philosopher's Stone, he would have uncovered the plot against his mission. Bringing prisoners back with him, instead of executing them or letting them drown, would mean he needed to justify a return. The only reason to return to the frontier is if he didn't find it. Thank you for trying. Or he found something else. Ponder that for a moment, Bernard. Securing the prisoners, the men we sent to steal the treasure, allows the Order of Eos to know of our involvement. It gave LeSueur a bargaining chip to save his life. Clerval pondered the idea. What about the possibility that the Philosopher's Stone sank to the depths of the ocean? A lock without a key? Could it forestall the end of the world? Would the ticking clock stop ticking? Would God change his mind about his failed creation? Several years ago, I would have jumped into the Atlantic to search for it. Possessing it meant power over my enemies. Now, I honestly would like to study it, to understand it. But ultimately, it would have met the same fate if I'd managed to acquire it. Destroying it, or in this case losing it, frees humanity from a prophesied doom. We are the defenders of the Elm, the Priory of Ormus, not a bunch of religious zealots like Eos trying to bring about the end of the world. How shall we deal with LeSueur? If any of his prisoners were our spies, and he allows them to live, then we will know the truth of what happened, and the location, Newton scoffed. Could he be that foolish? If the Philosopher's Stone is still buried, we no longer need LeSueur to lead us back, do we? The needle in the haystack has been clearly identified. If we can acquire him, we'll get the truth from his lips before we kill him. If not, let our enemies know why he's returning to France empty-handed. They can kill LeSueur for us. When you say enemies, do you mean Eos or all of them, Bernard? The Jesuits, Eos, the Periphery, all of them. Let the world know that LeSueur dug a copper mine where there was no copper and returned empty-handed. And what about the Philosopher's Stone? Perhaps it's best that it's at the bottom of the ocean. Now, the location of where it was found is the only thing that matters. It took the Order of Eos 130 years to send Christopher Columbus back to the New World to support their failed colonies. This will distract them. And in the chaos, we will strike. Let them worry about LeSueur and his stone. We have bigger fish to fry, don't we? We certainly do. These clumsy fools have made their move, yet have no plans for what comes next. First, let's have dinner, and then we will plot the destruction of our enemies. Chapter 27. The Seven Stars Pub, London, 1701. Edward Drummond sat alone in the booth, focused on getting to the bottom of the glass of beer. He'd sat in the booth beside the black-framed windows out of nervousness and paranoia. Having grown up on the sea, the strange motion of the London crowd made him nervous. Out on the ocean, spotting a ship 10 miles away caused alarm. Here, folks could sneak up on you in a blink. "Will that be all, sir?" the waitress asked, clearly enamored by him. "One more beer and then I'm off." The winter sun had already set, creating a reflection of himself in the window. At 21, he was still considered a young man, even if the sun and the wind had turned his skin to bronze leather. It made him laugh to see the tan marks on his cheeks and the pale skin of his jowls and chin. But he didn't want to look like a barbarian, so off the beard went. He wore a simple black suit, nothing outlandish or extravagant to draw attention to himself. The hunchback had visited him in the morning, reminding him of the meeting with Newton in the evening. But that had left much of the day to nervously consider the meeting. Even though his hotel was in Kensington, he decided to visit friendly streets. If things went sour, he knew where to seek shelter. When the last beer was finished, Drummond stood and felt the effects of the alcohol upon his 6-foot frame. He wasn't drunk, but his sea legs gave him pause. He paid the bill and walked out into the cold London night. Even though he didn't fear any soft city folks, he still looked both ways, knowing traps and alleyways had taken down even the mightiest of men. Once outside, he walked past the Royal Courts of Justice and onto Strand Street, which paralleled the Thames. With gardens and the river on one side and the seat of British government on the other, Drummond could not help but notice the irony of Stone and Flora. Like the other governmental building, the new War Office was straight stacked stone. Its owner, Lord William Blathwayt, would be abroad, but had already been briefed about the covert meeting with Newton. Drummond could see the upstairs window emitting light. "What do I have to lose?" He knocked firmly on the door, and the small man answered the doorway. Drummond handed him the invitation and was quickly led inside. "I'll take your coat. The others are assembling upstairs." "Oh, I want that on my ship," Drummond thought as soon as he walked into the crowded room. A golden wall with the entire planet painted upon it stood as the interior backdrop for the whole room. "Keep your land. I want to rule all that water." On the table, a monstrously large 20 by 80 foot structure, a mirror of the image allowed those seated around it to visualize the space and size of the empires in their sights. "It took me a few moments to wrap my brain around it also," one of the men said as he smoked a pipe. The man had a mustache that flipped up into 3-inch horns and a goat's beard of equal depth. "George Farrington." "Does he know me?" "Edward Drummond," Drummond reciprocated. "So, do you know what this is about to happen here?" "I've got a general idea. It's all been a bit clandestine from the start, but from what the hunchback told me, we all have a common experience and purpose." "And what's that?" "Hunting pirates. I know your reputation, Captain Farrington. You were the scourge to the Spanish merchant vessels along the Bay of Honduras." "Strange that I've never heard of Captain Drummond." "I'm probably the only man in this room who has yet to be selected as captain." "Then why are you here?" "I can provide what none of you other men can provide." "And what is that?" "I served under one of the most wanted men in the world, and I'll never forget his face." Drummond walked past Captain Farrington and the other captains who looked at him, and soon he stood at the great golden wall. The continent of Africa loomed large upon the wall, with Europe, especially England, small up near the ceiling. His eyes studied the large island below the Horn of Africa. "You must be the Scot," another man approached. "Clerval told me there was a wild card in the mix, and since I know many of these other men, it must be you." Drummond suddenly wished as if he had his beard, if only to feel like a seasoned sailor and not some pup. I've never set foot in Scotland, yet I am the Scot. Edward Drummond. I'm Roger Silverthorne, and from the looks of it, I've been on the sea as long as you've been alive. As senior captain, I'll be the admiral of the assembled fleet. Don't be a hero, don't get in our way, and all will be made right. Drummond knew of Silverthorne also. After meeting with the hunchback, he'd done his own investigation into the other men. Last I'd heard, you were raiding Portuguese merchant ships off the coast of Brazil. Our benefactor certainly has patience for his plan to develop. I know the name Drummond, yet you've never been to Scotland. How do you reconcile that, young Edward? Second sons. My father was a second son who came to Barbados to oversee sugarcane production. My older brother took to managing the plantation, and I took to the sea. I know what I'm doing on a ship. We'll soon find out, Captain Silverthorne said, rejoining the others. The last man to go out of his way for an introduction had little of the pomposity of the others. Dressed to dazzle, he had a white complexion and a double chin, a sign of wealth and luxury. Don't let these pompous fools intimidate you, young man. Most of them inherited their wealth and position, but when the cannons fire, we'll see if any of them can command men. Will you be commanding men? Me? No. I'm only a cog in the wheel. I helped assemble all this, though. By trade, I'm a fisherman, although for the past few decades I've only managed my expanding fleets. My name is Woodes Rogers. Edward Drummond. If this goes well, we'll both be governors of Caribbean islands. Follow orders, and we'll rise past all of this pettiness to take our place in the new world. A few minutes later, both the hunchback, Clerval, and his master Newton walked through the doors and sat at the head of the table. Clerval began with brief introductions for the men gathered together. Along with Captain Roger Silverthorne and George Farrington, Drummond was introduced to Captain Ned Ireland, Captain Thomas Bennett, Captain Robert Walsh, Black Robin Bellamont, and Captain Richard Cass. All were pirates in some fashion or another, looking for restoration. With all the money and allure thrown at them, Drummond understood perfectly well why they were there. When Newton rose from his place to speak, the purpose of the mission became clear. Gentlemen, 6 years ago, the Ganges Sawai was attacked while on a religious pilgrimage between Bombay and its destination at Mecca. The graphic incidents of the account notwithstanding, the sovereignty of England was challenged by a fleet of pirates, and the relationship between two powerful empires was threatened. While many of those responsible were brought to justice and hanged, justice has still been withheld. And men like Long Ben Avery are still alive? Both the Royal Navy and privateers were enlisted, to no avail, to find these men, which I anticipated shortly after the incident. 6 years ago, I sat down with Mr. Woodes Rogers and Captain Silverthorne to discuss what needed to happen to bring these men to justice. And that is why each of you has been brought here today. While we did not know which captains would be sitting here tonight, we did know what would be necessary for victory. All across England, our shipyards began producing state-of-the-line warships faster and more powerful. These ships have now been fitted, supplied, and given crews, and now they only wait for their captains to set sail. You may be wondering by what authority a college professor commands such a force, but as Mr. Clerval certainly explained, I received my authority a decade ago, long before I associated myself with the British government. My sovereign title has given me wealth and influence that goes beyond royal houses, but as Master of the Mint and representative of His Majesty, I can assure you, King William is as motivated as I am. He's talking about the Order of Ormus. The roots of the old elm still produce new growth. Do the others know this? For your Majesty, the insult is still fresh. For my office, this is a wound that has festered for 100 years now. It is a wound fashioned by betrayal, theft, and bloodshed. And if civilization is to continue, we must cut away the rot for healing to begin. You are my Black Fleet, and in darkness, without a political flag, you will also be the swift hand of justice. I have chosen 2 of you for leadership. For Admiral of the Black Fleet, I have selected Roger Silverthorne. For Commander of our Marine Forces, Edward Drummond has been chosen. First, I will have Admiral Silverthorne explain our naval strategy. Drummond felt a smirk, knowing Newton had given him power the others wanted. Even while Silverthorne spoke, Drummond could feel the eyes of the other captains upon him, judging him. One by one, he stared down each pirate until they looked away. Finally, his eyes joined the others as Silverthorne positioned each of the 8 ships around the island of Madagascar. 8 warships, with 100 Marines on each, gives him command of 800 men. And I mean to put them to good use, just not for the purpose Newton imagines. Chapter 28. The War Office, London, 1701. Once all the other men were on their way, Newton turned to Edward Drummond, who once again stood at the Golden Wall. Such an imposing figure. Lesser men will follow him to their deaths. He's perfect. Your briefing was all I could have hoped for, Newton said honestly. Your service in India with Pitt has made you the perfect man for coastal invasion and siege tactics, but I asked you to stay to discuss other matters, older matters. The towering Scot did not move from the map. He's almost as big as Pierre Charles Le Sueur. I should have hired him to kill the traitor. Alas, Le Sueur is probably dead already. Come, sit down. Clerval will bring the fine wines, Newton said, turning a chair so the 2 of them could sit together at the end of the table, each near a corner. Clerval has told me the story, but could you tell me, in your own words, what happened with the mutiny of Captain Gibson? Still, no emotion emitted from the young man's face. Alas, a soldier, but not a general. With such perfect physical traits, I must forgive his simplicity. Drummond glanced down at the wine glass and began telling his story without a sip. It seems like a lifetime ago. I was a young junior bosun, and because of my education and size for my youth, I found myself at the side of Admiral Byrne. Yes, you joined the crew out of Bermuda in the spring of 1694. I've read the official records of his mutiny. I want to hear it from your perspective. There were 2 ships, the Charles II and the James. While Captain Humphreys was a decent bloke, Captain Gibson was a buffoon, and Admiral Byrne was a coward. We knew if we were to engage the Spanish, these men would bring about our ruin. Long Ben Avery was the first mate on the Charles, but he championed the crew in the unfair wages and treatment while we were still in Spain. When we anchored prior to our first battle, Captain Gibson took to drinking, further disgusting the men who knew their lives were on the line. Admiral Byrne, however, decided to sleep ashore. Old slights fester with him. My slights go back centuries. Prior to the engagement, we were still a few miles from our destination, and when O'Byrne learned there were exotic women in the village, He insisted on embarking to enjoy himself on shore. When Avery heard of this, he knew it was time to act. He took 25 men from the James, paddled across at night, and rushed the crew of the Charles. The two ships were in constant communication, even though not all men knew of the mutiny. "So you were aboard the Charles II?" Newton asked, enjoying the first-hand account much more than the one he'd already read. "I was, but the mutiny was bloodless, with Admiral Byrne on shore. By the time Captain Humphreys discovered the situation, Avery had taken possession of the ship, and when the James fired on us, we fled for open sea, as did Humphreys once he collected the Admiral. The Avery I knew was not a bloodthirsty villain, and after bringing us from America to Africa, he left us at the British Fort James in Gambia, where I again found myself resuming service in His Majesty's Navy." "It's time for us to speak plainly," Newton said. "Officially, I have selected you to lead this expedition because you personally know Long Ben Avery. Both King William and the Grand Mughal want Avery's head on a spike, and I do believe you are the right man to deliver it, but you will have another purpose, in addition to exterminating pirates. Once, the Drummond clan controlled Scotland, and if you achieve the goal of your mission, I will restore your family to prominence, both in Scotland and here in England." "What do I need to do?" "I need you to return something that has been stolen from me," Newton finished. "The world will soon learn the strength of the old elm remains as strong as ever." Chapter 29. The Tower of London, 1701. Even though Newton had scheduled himself a day of rest following the meeting with the Black Cat fleet captains, he found himself at the Royal Mint shortly after lunch. Knowing all of his tasks had been completed for the rest of the week, he listlessly walked through his offices, tidying for the better part of 2 hours. When done, he still had no purpose. The solitude left Newton feeling morose. Catherine tended to the political side of his ploys, and Woodes Rogers left ahead of the fleet to prepare the net that would crush any survivors from the coming slaughter. He already missed his collection of captains leading his Black Fleet. All of them had departed from various ports, and with them, Bernard had also left on new errands. Now, he had time to wait. It crossed his mind to drive up to Cambridge, but matters of science no longer filled his thoughts. Could revenge fill his heart? "I never should have given myself an unscheduled day. I know better than to waste the time I've been given." He put his jacket on and stepped out of the office. The Tower of London was a misshapen hexagram with a private walk inside the outer wall that allowed him to take strolls from time to time. After 4 years as warden of the Mint and another year as master of the Mint, he knew the complex well. Today, after 3 laps around the grounds, he paused at St. Thomas's Tower and walked inside, ignoring the guards and soldiers, until he stood over the ramparts overlooking the Thames. Standing in the open air, he took in the view from atop the wall, scanning the river below, the city along the opposite bank, and the Tower Bridge spanning the Thames. He stood there for only a few minutes before a guard stopped beside him. "I don't see any French ships sailing up that river," he smugly told the guard, who earnestly looked downstream for a moment. "No, I suppose they wouldn't try it, seeing us on duty." Newton chuckled. When it is time to serve, all you can do is do your duty." "I would drink to that sentiment, but perhaps not on duty." "Ah, yes, duty." Duty had dropped onto his lap a decade earlier. He did not ask for it, nor did he inherit it, although he did inherit Clairvaux, who was given to him without condition. Years earlier, a faceless conclave within the Priory of Ormus voted, and he was given the strings of the marionette. He'd almost suffered a nervous breakdown trying to take in all the knowledge at once. But when he came out of it, he knew what needed to be done. "Were you here during Thomas More's imprisonment?" Newton asked. The guard smirked at one of the tower's most infamous prisoners. "Sir Thomas More was lodged here a few years before I began working here." Thomas More believed it was possible to create a utopia here on Earth. Then again, he was a bloody Catholic. "Do you believe it is possible to create a paradise on Earth?" "I'm not one to speak on politics or religion." "I agree. Well, the concept of a utopia is that mankind can create a civilization that attains perfection. Why else does God let us linger for so long if not to strive for this? Mankind has already sunken to the depths of depravity, but what if we can build something close to the Garden of Eden once again? Do you believe mankind is capable of such a thing?" Upon becoming the Grand Shepherd of the Priory of Ormus, he'd been given the troves of secret knowledge that all but drove him to madness. In his insanity, he'd even calculated the end of the world. Now he could only hear the ticking of his doomsday clock. The guard shrugged. "Garden of Eden? It depends on the management, I suppose." "The management, yes. I suppose it does. The Catholic Church wants to subjugate the world with tyranny. The Order of Eos wants to destroy the world and give it back to fallen gods and demons. How can we create a new Atlantis when we fight with our cousins in France? Do you know why France is our enemy?" The guard shook his head. "It all began with a fight over a tree." "A tree?" "A great elm tree. A sacred tree to some. It's strange how so many of the world's religions revere the tree as sacred. Genesis tells of 2 trees, while Norse mythology has Yggdrasil, upon which Odin sacrificed himself for knowledge. While those trees were symbolic, the tree that began our great conflict was quite literal, planted in a field near Gisors." "In France?" "Yes, but this was long before France existed. This was a time when the Roman Empire still stood, and we were still savages upon this island. A tree was planted as a promise." "What kind of promise?" the guard asked, even though he'd acted as if he'd rather be any other place than with Newton. "I'm doing this for you and your dull children. That we could make the world a better place, that we could create a new Atlantis. For 800 years this tree grew, and those that planted it became the Normans, populating both England and France. Even though the progress was slow, it was a steady progress, and the plan, like the tree, grew strong and bore fruit." "So what happened?" "Common cause brought nations together for a great crusade. Are you familiar?" "Of course. We took back the Holy Lands from the Muslims." "Yes. A purpose like taking something back gave these men clarity. They took back Jerusalem and more, and then the path of destiny reached a fork. 2 branches of the same Norman family began to develop different plans for the future. King Henry II of England and King Philip Augustus of France met at the 800-year-old elm to discuss their differences. Each had claimed part of a great prize in the taking of Jerusalem, but just like the Catholic Church broke apart because of differing opinions, so too did this union." In giving his answer, the French king sent men not to assassinate his cousin, but to cut down the tree. The English king had his men defend the elm. The guard looked disinterested, yet formed a simple question. "So what happened to the tree?" "That was 500 years ago, so the tree was always destined to collapse. But the defenders of Ormus, or the Elm as we call it now, remain, Newton said, patting the man on the shoulder and walking away. And I am the grand shepherd for the Priory of Ormus. A new tree had been planted, and when Newton was given care of the tree, he became the 19th defender of the elm. He could only imagine the reason he'd been chosen, but he knew this role would be different. While the others had diligently cared for the new tree in hopes of creating a new paradise around it, he knew the garden could not grow unless he ripped out all the weeds and old growth. Chapter 30. Tortuga Island, Hispaniola, 1702. The island of Tortuga was first colonized in 1625 as an establishment for buccaneers in the Caribbean. Located a few miles off the coast of Hispaniola Island, it became a stronghold for buccaneers attacking Spanish colonies. Originally named Tortuga, or the Turtle, by Christopher Columbus, possession of the island switched from Spanish to French and then to English control during the 1600s. In 1640, Fort de Rocher was built by the French to defend the ships in the natural harbor between Tortuga and Haiti from Spanish attacks, resulting in it becoming a pirate haven. Famed buccaneers such as Henry Morgan and Francois L'Olonnais used Tortuga as a base for their raids, but after the Spanish destroyed the fort, it became more valuable for its lumber than as a port. By 1697, Spain surrendered ownership of the island to France. By the spring of 1702, marooned ship carpenter Giovanni Naufragio had seen enough of the island to last a lifetime. As usual, none of the men were awake when Naufragio woke, and the small hamlet of half a dozen simple homes was silent. He'd built each house himself. The largest building, now the canteen, had been the first structure the crew of the Adventure Prize built of unhewn timber and thatch 3 years earlier. It stood the first night and lasted through 2 hurricanes. The other buildings came in order of rank. Sailing master Manuel del Toro received the first cut wood structure, replete with an elevated floor, 2 windows with shutters, a shingled roof, and steps down to the sand. For the next 5 months, each of the sailors received a home, and finally, the 3 powder monkeys, who were now men rather than boys, received their homes also. Wooden sidewalks connected the homes, and the dock was built into the lagoon, followed by 2 fishing boats. That was the first year, the year Captain Kidd was arrested in Boston. While Kidd was being taken to England the summer of 1700, Naufragio busied himself by harnessing the power of mountain streams to build a small mill that allowed them to cut enough lumber to trade at Port-au-Pas across the channel. Once a month, one of the sailors and a powder monkey would be chosen to row the goods over to Haiti and sell the lumber, bringing back enough goods and entertainment to last the month. They even had enough lumber on hand to directly sell to pirates or privateers that came looking for the old fort or the port of Captain Morgan. By 1701, they were well-to-do businessmen in a small village of 100. Now, all Naufragio had to decide would he walk the beach or the mountain path. Every other day, he would leave his house in the small village of Terabasa and walk along the beach trail for 10 miles until he reached the hidden alcove. Today was one of those days. Up the slopes from where he stood, a wooden mountain allowed a more direct path in the shade of the trees. It had solid footing, but no visibility. 3 years after self-marooning on the island, Naufragio still liked his walks on the beach, which allowed him to view the wildlife. Haiti across the channel, and the sleeping green giant loomed to the north. While the beach in the morning meant he'd have shelter of the mountain path in the late afternoon. Midway through the pattern journey, Naufragio reached Mare Rouge, where Huguenot refugees found shelter after France took possession of Haiti. First mate Gareth Legrand had purchased their patience, and the religious exiles greeted Naufragio with breakfast each day he passed. The refugees were happy to know a small militia of armed men protected them. Just before noon, he reached his familiar destination, Trobasseau. Captain Legrand had named the place when the crew was still together. After he told them about his plan, "Hike up those farmer pants and get to it," Legrand barked with his devilish grin. Every other day, Naufragio dropped those trousers at Farmer Pants' pool, wrapped them around his shoulder, and walked out into the pool. Legrand had speculated that either a mudslide or a massive hurricane had created the pool, which was protected from view by the 50 yards of jungle growing upon the fertile soil. A narrow underwater sandbar separated the main pool from a smaller pocket. It was the underwater sandbar that served as a loading dock for the past 3 years. Sitting in the pool, waiting for its daily inspection, the 350-ton Mughal ship, the Quetta Merchant, rested. The bane of my existence. For the past 3 years, he'd maintained it, stripped off its 3 masts and rigging, and camouflaged with jungle brush tied to its side. The ship Captain Kidd renamed the Adventure Prize had all been but neutered. Naufragio climbed up the rest of the ship to inspect it for rot or damage. Every few weeks, when warranted, the rest of the remaining crew would join him and give the ship a good once-over before returning to the lumber mill and village. Naufragio hated the ship as much now as he did 4 years ago. Kidd was wrong about Culliford, and the fool was wrong about the Quetta Merchant. No wonder he was arrested and sent to London. Legrand, however, saw the ship as a miraculous omen, and after filling men with tales of glorious wealth and the supernatural, the crew chose to listen to him and delay their mutiny of Kidd. Patience, Legrand argued, would allow him to gain information about an enemy and reveal an even greater treasure. First, Legrand's instincts were proven correct when Kidd was arrested. Then he explained his plan. Some would go to London to verify what happened to Kidd. Others would accompany Legrand back to the edges of New France. Naufragio and the rest simply had to wait, just like the treasures would wait. They voted to enact his plan to the man. Now Naufragio did his part to keep the ship seaworthy. After inspecting the entire ship, he waded back across the sandbar and found the place in the trees where the ship masts were stored. The ship had not shown rot, thanks to his proper maintenance. He leaned against the stumps, and supporting the mast, he caught his breath for a few moments. Although Naufragio had been born in Naples, he spent his whole life upon the sea, so 3 years on the island of Tortuga left him yearning for a good storm, just to fix something. As the ship's carpenter, he'd experienced the thrills of battle, sinking, storms, and fires, and in all cases, his ability to improvise and create solutions from thin air made his work so rewarding. Reassembling the ship was the next challenge that awaited him. Naufragio began the arduous hike up the mountain slope, knowing the walk back to the village would be more efficient. His only companion for his walk home were the birds that filled the jungle forests. In one of the forest clearings, his heart suddenly stopped. Then his feet propelled his body, running down the trail as fast as he could. A large ship had not only entered the canal, but had anchored offshore from the village. Chapter 31, Tortuga, 1702. Sailing master Manuel del Toro set his loaded rifle aside, but tucked his pistol in his holster, along with his cutlass. "This could be a trap to lure us out," del Toro said to his men. "I'll meet them down at the docks, and if they are friendly, I will bend down and tie my shoelaces. If I keep my shoe untied, it's a trap, and you need to run to the hills, or these men will flay you alive to get your secrets in your head. Is that understood?" Even though a single boat rode to the docks, the ship readied other boats for either resupply or attack. He looked up and down the shore and even turned around to see if a war party was coming from the north side of the island, up and over the mountain. "Where are you, Giovanni?" Giovanni Naufragio was still not back from his trip to the ship, and if the others had been taken prisoners, then the interlopers might strike at the ship first. Giovanni could be dead, for all I know. In curiosity, the villagers had already rushed to the docks. In the days of Captain Morgan, the village hosted hundreds of people who provided services to the pirate ships. Now, few ships bothered to pull into shore without a purpose. Del Toro recognized the ship and hoped. The Flying Sylphs were a fleet of pirate ships based out of Port-au-Prince on the western side of the island. Organized by Captain Vincent Galloway, behaved like Robin Hood and his merry men, outcasts who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. Perverts more than pirates, he'd once observed with the lot. Gareth Legrand had once had a sword fight with Galloway, and instead of killing each other, they became close friends. Del Toro had hoped to see the Malay, or even Jacob's Phoebe, or the bitch pirate captain Athena McCormick's Eurydice, but that was not what he saw. The ship in the bay, the Daphne, once belonged to Captain Archibald Varro. It could all be a ruse, Del Toro told himself as he walked down the path to the docks. Even though Del Toro had a Spanish name, he despised Europeans. He hailed from the original Taino chieftains who lived on the island of Puerto Rico before Columbus. His mother had claimed. The Taino ruled the seas around Cuba, the Bahamas, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico, waging sea battles with the Carib Indians who lived on the smaller islands to the southeast. Although his family gained independence from slavery through fishing, Del Toro's knowledge of local reefs turned into a career upon the ocean as guide and eventually as quartermaster. Now, the descendant of Taino chieftains prepared to defend the island of a once mighty empire. Using the crowd as a shield, the squatty man wove through the local villagers until he saw the boat tying up on the dock. His grip on the pistol eased when he saw his friend narrow Bon amongst the group of white men. Bon stuck his finger in his ear and began scratching, and Del Toro knelt down and began to tighten his shoelaces. Just as he tightened his laces, he saw another ship entering the channel. Chapter 32, Tortuga, hours later. That night, the officers of the Adventure Prize sat around a fire to exchange information. For Master Gunner Benjamin Horn, it was the first time in 2 years he'd seen the rest of the crew sent off on separate quests. He sat at the little wooden village built by Naufragio, its ship's Italian carpenter, in a primitive structure referred to as the cantina. Captain Kidd is dead, Jimmy Duke, the bosun from Boston, began, explaining how the charges and trial had all been a setup, culminating in the hanging of their former captain in London. Our true enemy has been revealed, Narrowbon added, and the sailing master from the Himalayas explained the story about how a Whig minister named Isaac Newton, who first commissioned the Adventure Galley, had turned on its American captain when he broke faith. Legrand's theory about a stolen treasure checked out, English bosun Drake Murray confirmed. Not only were these secret societies real, but they were also quite active. This Newton fellow has been building a private fleet, and if we're not ready, he's going to steal the Templar treasure before we do. For agreeing to the plan, the surviving crew all shared Captain Kidd's existing loot, but Legrand had promised much more. They then spent a few minutes debating the value of the original plan involving the Mississippi River quest against the merits of returning to Madagascar. Horn had no interest in the Philosopher's Stone, but Legrand promised him to help find the missing Ark stolen by the Templars centuries earlier. "So, where is Legrand?" Del Toro asked. The men returning from Canada explained their part of the story next. Legrand insisted that his most valuable men stay with the ship, including Benjamin. And now that the plan slowly came back together, he dreamed of leaving Tortuga soon. We abducted an Indian chief in Montreal, Pierre Leduc said bitterly. Kondiaronk had information about the treasure, Dr. Barrow explained. Hold on, Duke interrupted. Are we talking about a fellow from India or a native? Huron chief from the Great Lakes region, Barrow clarified. Are you kidding me? Duke continued his exasperation. What the hell information would a Huron chief have about our treasure? He's a bloody savage. Actually, he's one of the most brilliant men I've ever met. He united dozens of tribes against your colonies and knew several languages. I don't care how many languages he knows, Duke pressed. Why did we spend all that time and energy getting a man from Montreal when Newton is preparing to beat us to the punch? Dr. Barrow had no answers and looked down. Where is Legrand? Why didn't he come back with you, Doctor? He departed on the Eurydice for France, Barrow carelessly explained. With McCormick? Duke scoffed. We cross the Atlantic with homely Willow Thomas and Legrand gets a goddess? How could he suffer for us like that? Imagine the agonies. He's after the Philosopher's Stone, stolen by our enemies, Bond explained. Hold on a second. A small uproar erupted in the men. He left us here so he could chase after the treasure for himself, Del Toro shouted. This wasn't the original pack, Naufragio added. A good first mate would not allow these men to question a captain, Horn thought in the silence. While Legrand was brilliant as Kidd's first mate, he should have found a first mate before we flew to the winds. All the other roles are filled except for the man who watches his back. I must watch his back. Horn cleared his throat, preparing to do his part to keep the crew together. Horn was the newest of the officers, but he'd spent his life upon the sea. Now he needed Legrand to return or risk being lost on the far side of the world. I was here when we elected to make Gareth Legrand our new captain, and I listened as he convinced all of you of a treasure even larger than the one previously offered. While I cannot claim to know what's inside of his mind, I do understand what he seeks. Go ahead, Horn. Explain it to us, Drake Murray said with a mocking tone. Are you familiar with the King Solomon from the Bible? Horn asked. From the Bible? Del Toro asked. King Solomon of Israel. Yes, the King Solomon from the Bible, Horn placated. This might surprise some of you, but my native country of Abyssinia is a Christian nation. One of the wise men traveled from Aksum to visit the Christ child, and after our Lord and Savior was crucified, we welcomed the Gospels long before the Romans did. Before Christ, we were devoted, if not more so, to the God of Abraham as were the ancient Hebrews. In the time of King Solomon, our great queen Makeda traveled to ancient Jerusalem to behold the wisdom of the legendary king. Queen of Sheba? Jimmy Duke asked. I call bullshit. Yes, Abyssinia was once known as Sheba, and when our queen returned, she returned with more than just an heir of Solomon. She returned with secret knowledge. Drake Murray scoffed. You're starting to sound like Legrand. Did you ever wonder why he spared my life? Because we needed a gunner? No, I was spared before the Culliford incident. He spared my life because I knew his secret. But before he could act on this knowledge, he had to confirm his friends and enemies. We've all come back to this place because we are his friends, but I hope it'll be for something greater." "Money is money," Jimmy Duke said. "More money is more better." The rankled crew suddenly enjoyed a laugh. All their greedy eyes looked for more inspiration to wait even longer to become rich. When King Solomon first became ruler, he was tasked with building the temple in Jerusalem. When he finished, it was the greatest wonder in the world, rivaled only by the pyramids in Egypt. The cost of building it was high, but not in financial terms. It cost Solomon his soul. To build a temple worthy of God, and as grand as his father King David dreamed, Solomon was faced with a paradox. "A pair of what?" Duke chuckled. "A Gordian knot, you fool," Murray chided. "A no-win possibility." Horn had been educated in his youth before committing to a life at sea. The men he needed were mostly simpletons, including his own countrymen. Solomon knew that according to Mosaic law, the altar of God could only be built of unhewn stone. Solomon's plans were far more elaborate than a great pile of rocks, so he began walking down a path that would eventually lead him to setting aside God for the dark gods of his concubines. "Is this where the Queen of Sheba comes in?" Del Toro asked. "No, Solomon first came to Aksum in order to learn secrets from antiquity. My people still knew the stories of the old world, and she showed him a strategy for building his temple without breaking the code. She told him of an ancient foreign sorcerer king who first learned the dark arts and how he'd crafted an entire city out of a mountain face with a mystical stone. She had ancient maps of the lands where the sorcerer king lived, but none of it matched the known world. Solomon quickly became convinced of the veracity of the map and created a great expedition to find the lands. Queen Makeda gave him her most trusted advisor, Kobeki, as part of this great expedition. With Phoenician sailors and a coalition of the known world's greatest minds, Solomon sent a fleet to scour the world looking for the Sorcerer King's magical rock that could transform any known submaterial. For all the world knew, these men walked off the edge of the earth and vanished. Years later, news came that Solomon had somehow managed to build the temple without the Sorcerer King's magical rock. So Queen Makeda went to Jerusalem to see for herself what Solomon had done. History forgot all about the failed expedition. 20 years ago in Canada, a young fur trader found what King Solomon's expedition could not. "Legrand's treasure is a magical rock?" Jimmy Duke asked. The men chuckled. Despite being hard men, they all wanted to believe in the supernatural. Solomon did not seek treasure. He sought a tool capable of breaking the paradox. When his men did not return, Solomon began turning to the dark arts himself, and according to the legend, he became as powerful as the original Sorcerer King, but with imperfect knowledge. He crafted a new device to shape matter without human toil. "How did he accomplish this?" Naraban asked. "He consulted the dark spirits, who witnessed the laying of the foundations of the earth. With his new knowledge, he harnessed a demon. And with stolen knowledge, he created a strange green substance known as the shamir. This is how he learned to command stone." "Legrand's treasure is green goo?" Duke restated, seeking smiles. "Command stone?" Naufragio asked. "Could he command wood also?" "How did he command stone?" Del Toro asked. Horn took a deep breath, knowing that he needed to reveal to the crew the big picture. Solomon created a ring, and the inscriptions upon it contained magical phrases once used to help form our world. With this ring, he built the Temple of Solomon without breaking Mosaic law. The temple was made without seam or fissure, making it the world's greatest wonder. When Makeda heard, she traveled to Jerusalem to see for herself which is where you've heard of her in the Bible. For Solomon's idolatry, God brought ruin and destruction to the kingdom of Israel. But the secrets of Solomon and his treasure remained hidden for almost 2,000 years, until a new order from Europe arrived to steal both away. The Knights of the Temple of Solomon, Naraban said, nodding his head. The legendary Templar Knights. We're going after the Templar treasure, Jimmy Duke grinned. Legrand saved my life because I knew the story that sent men like himself into the frontier after the Philosopher's Stone. Together, we had several pieces to the old puzzle, but he needed to clarify much of the rest. Even if the Philosopher's Stone is lost to us, we still have 2 other great treasures to pursue. Naraban nodded in appreciation as the crew relaxed. Legrand has been true to his word so far. Yes, he had to alter the first plan, but he promised he'd return soon with answers. Benjamin Horn stood with the navigator and gave the men a new dream. Legrand left me here because I know about these other 2 treasures. He needs me, and I need him. Legrand will return to us as soon as he can. A lowly thief can know where a treasure is locked away, Bon added. But if it is guarded or locked in a vault, what good does this knowledge do for a thief? The Huron chief we met, he took Captain Legrand to a place where the Sorcerer King's kingdom once stood. That is why Legrand had to risk abducting him. How much does Naraban know about these treasures? For now, he seemed like an ally. I'll give them the same promise Legrand gave me. The treasure I seek is locked in a vault none of you could fathom, and there are 2 known keys that can unlock it. You wanted to know where Captain Legrand went? He went to find the man who possesses one of these keys. Chapter 33. La Rochelle, France, December 1703. The port city of La Rochelle had a complicated history, switching hands between England and French control. When tensions rose between the 2 nations allied for the Great Crusades, it became part of a dowry in 1152 when Henry Plantagenet, later Henry II of England, married Eleanor of Aquitaine, bringing the seaport temporarily under House Plantagenet control. After the splitting of the Elm at Gisors in 1188, the Templar Knights expanded control of the port, making it their primary port during 3 centuries of influence. Legend asserts that Knights Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay brought his fleet of 18 ships from Cyprus to La Rochelle as a show of force. But it was too late. When the Edict of Friday the 13th, 1307 was executed, the Knights Templar all across Europe were killed or arrested. Grand Master Jacques de Molay found himself arrested by his united papal and Norman enemies. Although de Molay did not personally escape, rumors grew that the 18 ships vanished, laden with secret treasures and a small army of Templar fugitives. For the next 2 centuries, the port saw frequent conflict as empires of France, Spain, and England filled the strategic bay with blood. From 1568 to 1572, French Protestants, the Huguenots, declared themselves an independent reformed republic. This state within a state eroded over the next century until the wars of religion in France left them persecuted, exiled, or killed for their beliefs. At the time of the attack of the Ganges Sawai in the Red Sea in 1695, the rejuvenated part of La Rochelle had recently witnessed the departure of Canadian explorer Robert de La Salle with the commission to establish a French fort at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Although La Salle had managed to explore the Great Lakes and the newly discovered upper Mississippi, His 1684 expedition ended in failure and his own death. Knowing all of this, Louis Armand Guerin sat on an old rug between two barrels and simply watched. With his head shaved to the scalp, a bandana wrapped around his face to hide his eye, and clothing of a beggar, he sat in anonymity, just as he'd done for the better part of a month. Beside him, hidden in a barrel, a dead Englishman with a fresh knife wound kept him company. They'd discover the assassin also waiting to find and kill Lesueur. In the dead man's pocket, a letter from Master of the English Mint Isaac Newton. Guerin had fabricated it himself, but Farmer General Alexandre Le Houlier, the leader of the Order of Eos, would blame Newton. Regardless of how this ends, our enemies will tear each other apart. Nearby, the Loire waited at the dock, its heavy cargo loaded and its crew of soldiers now accepted. Once its commander, Pierre-Charles Lesueur, arrived, it had set sail. The 30-gun warship was destined for the Caribbean, specifically to reinforce the newly established Fort Mobile near the mouth of the Alabama River. Its most important item had yet to be loaded. Then Guerin saw the monster walking through the crowd. Even at 46, the bear of a man seemed the most formidable person on the docks, especially with his tall, muscular frame that held almost 300 pounds. Guerin had met him 3 separate times over the past 2 decades, when he took control of Fort Mackinac, at the Battle of Quebec, and a few years earlier when Captain Kidd took him to Newton. Now, servants and low-ranking soldiers began to unpack Lesueur's belongings from the carriage. Lesueur, the world's most wanted man. Their search for the French explorer had been relatively easy. Instead of hiding, Pierre-Charles Lesueur embraced the spotlight as he visited noblemen and the royal court after his recent mining expedition to America. Strangely, despite returning without copper, the royal court and financier Alexander Le Houlier funded a return trip to Louisiana Territory. Lesueur must be stopped from returning to America, Guerin decided as he hid. Kidnapping him will be our secondary concern. At a hiding place near the gangway leading to the Loire, another beggar emerged from hiding, weaving discreetly through the flow of traffic, stopping 20 yards from where the carriage parked. Even if Newton or Le Houlier still have spies nearby, they would not see my trap for what it is. None of the crowd understood what was happening, for the busy port saw thousands of passengers loading hundreds of ships, both merchant and warship. Guerin looked for Captain Galloway's small vanguard of killers, who dispersed across the docks. Each wore orange, but he could only spot 2 of the 10. 4 of us against an axe-wielding maniac. Those are terrible odds. Although it had taken several years to catch up to the quest for the Philosopher's Stone, Guerin had finally gotten ahead of the Jesuits, Order of Eos, and even Newton's Priory of Ormus. Now, we'll see if my gambit works. Gaspar had the honor to spring the trap. The squatty beggar wore gray, simple clothing, and as instructed, found a place just adjacent to the path to the Loire, so an embedded spy would not be watching. Finally, the trap was sprung. "Hey, Beanpole!" Gaspar's call went out. "Beanpole, it's me!" Guerin had made Gaspar practice it a dozen times to get the right inflection and the tone just right. The giant's head swiveled, sensing danger. He's weighing the consequence of it all. Father Marquette called him that name. No one in La Rochelle would know to call him by that name. Guerin grinned at the cruelty of his trap and counted time in his head. 30 seconds passed, and the well-dressed ogre continued unpacking his belongings for another trip across the Atlantic. Neither the men helping with the carriage or the crew passing by took any note when the beggar called out and waved in the wrong direction from the intended prey. Nor did they give it much note when he called out again a minute later. "Bon Jean! Paul Bon Jean! It's me, your old friend Jacques!" This time, the new magistrate of the Alabama colony stepped away from his belongings to follow the voice. Gaspard turned around to face Pierre-Charles Lesueur. It took a few moments for Lesueur to recognize his political rival from his days at Fort Mackinac, for he no longer looked like Kondiaronk, the chieftain of the Huron Confederacy, or Gaspar, the village leader of the Petun. The two titans of the fur trade industry stood 50 yards from each other for the better part of a minute, and then Gaspar slowly began to walk towards the monolith of confusion. As Gaspar passed, he whispered the words he'd practiced upon the Phoebe, and as soon as they were spoken, Lesueur clutched his pistol, and his head spun around, knowing the teeth of the bear trap was clamped down around his foot. He looked for only a few seconds, and then he followed, lest he lose Gaspar. As he passed the wagon, he spoke something to his men, but none of them followed. Guerin locked eyes with Gaspar as he neared the hiding place. He's as terrified as I am. Still unseen by Lesueur, Guerin looked to his men in orange, who stayed where they were until the signal was given. Guerin rose from his spot, turned his back to the approaching men, and tipped the barrel over, making sure the lid came loose. Blame must fall on Newton. He took the canteen of blood from his side, uncapped it, and opened it at the opening of the barrel. They must learn Lesueur was taken by force. As Gaspar reached him, he joined him, step for step, with the canteen trailing blood as they walked. As Lesueur neared the blood trail, Guerin glanced back, winking at the man who'd almost killed him at Fort Mackinac. This time, I don't have a company of Marines to save me, he thought, and if Lesueur doesn't take the bait, I doubt a ship full of pirates could save me from his wrath. Chapter 34, La Rochelle, France, 2 days later. Gaspar rose almost as tired as when he'd entered his bed. The sounds of torture filled the night as they anchored off the French coast. Shortly before dawn, Pierre-Charles Lesueur stopped screaming. Did they kill him? Gaspar donned his foreign clothing and walked out onto the deck of the ship. Several of the crew members had been part of the abduction, and their esteem for him and his successful plan grew in their eyes. I've gained their respect and lost respect for myself. Wart Jacobs, Athena McCormack, and Louis Armand Guerin stood on the deck. Their conversation stopped as they saw Gaspar. Tough brute, Jacobs admitted. I see why you held him in such highest regard. Is Lesueur dead? Gaspar asked. He's alive, Guerin said, but Athena had a difficult time getting a consistent story out of him. We were just debating what to do. Gaspar noticed the blood splatter on the white she-devil's forearms and cheek. I told you, she said to Guerin. Another hour or two, I'll get the full story from him. Oh, I don't doubt you, darling. You are Hecate incarnate in a torture chamber. But I think it is time we try another tactic. It's time we let Gaspar have a turn with him. On the morrow, we must return home to Tortuga. What did he claim? Gaspar asked. Come, Guerin said, putting a hand on Gaspar's shoulder. Let's catch you up on the details. Perhaps I should have returned to Lesueur to Kiox's pyre and saved him from all this pain. He doesn't deserve any of this. At the prow of the anchored ship, Guerin stopped to speak privately with Gaspar. Do you remember the fellow I introduced you to a few weeks ago, before Lesueur? The man who collected my fictitious manuscript, the Dutchman. The false narrative about our trip to the Blue Earth. New Voyages to New North America by Louis Armand de l'Homme d'Arcy de la Houghton, in which Addario played the role of the noble savage. During the past year, while they hunted for Lesueur, Gaspar had reviewed the manuscript. He nodded. The Dutchman was an agent of the periphery. He briefed me, and I briefed him. Most of what you learned on the frontier is true. Lesueur was released by Newton, sailed directly to the Gulf, and with the help from his brothers-in-law, went up the Mississippi River with a crew of miners. Beyond that, the details are murky. Before you feel any pity for our friend, know this. Pierre Charles Lesueur is a dead man. Regardless of the status of the Philosopher's Stone, he's been marked for death by Newton and the Priory of Ormus. Understand? No, Gaspar held firm. I do understand why we need to torture him, but we do not need to kill him. Years ago, when you explained how the periphery was different from the kings and popes of Europe, I thought we were servants of the same God. I believe you are torturing a righteous man. Lesueur? Righteous? Please! He murdered prisoners with his axe. We were at war with forces of darkness. Do you remember what you said when you said that to me? The man you tortured last night was sent by a star to find a sacred object to use in a war against this darkness. What sense is there in killing him? If he gave the Philosopher's Stone to our enemies, then he is our enemy. It's that simple. Life is never simple, Gaspar added, frustrated. Am I wrong about Lesueur? What else did you learn? At first, much of what he said matches what your spies heard coming out of the frontier about a French ship traveling up the Mississippi, Garen said. The periphery spies in Europe confirm that he returned earlier in the year and that he went directly to the farmer General Lehoulier, an alchemist. The ship he was about to board was an Io ship bound for the Gulf. If he brought them the Philosopher's Stone, why would Io send him back? Gaspar asked. You're missing my point. If not for us, the Priory's assassin would have killed him. We forestalled the inevitable. Gaspar shook his head. Yes, Garen ran the show, but he'd also purposely abducted Gaspar for his counsel. I must hold firm on this. I must not let him kill Lesueur. It doesn't have to be us, Gaspar insisted. We are supposed to be godly men. I suppose that's why I let Athena do the torturing, Garen chuckled, and then grew solemn in remorse. I can't honestly release him. What did he confess? Gaspar asked again. At first, he told Athena the same story the rest of the world is learning. He reached the fabled land of the Undine, the land of the Blue Woman that the Sioux called Mikado, where he spent the better part of a year building Fort Lehoulier and mining the copper. He told tales of buffalo, bitter cold, curious bands of local Sioux, and how they created tons of blue vitriol. The Sioux led him. Apparently, most of them were fighting Etienne Delhut and the Chippewa in the far north, leaving only old men and women behind in their haunted valley. When spring came, he left the fort in the hands of some Canadians sent by Delhut and traveled back down the Mississippi River with his cargo, which he loaded into a Lemoyne ship and crossed the Atlantic to La Rochelle, where we found him ready to return. That's the story we've heard from other sources as well. If he's being honest with us, then why are we still torturing him? Life with pirates had hardened Garen over the past decade, who laughed beneath his smirking grin. When Athena McCormick has your balls in one hand and a needle in the other, it's surprising what comes out of your mouth. Lesueur told another tale last night. Would you like to hear that tale? What did you do, Lesueur? Gaspar nodded. The periphery had an agent on the expedition, a carpenter named Pennicott, and when we told Lesueur this detail, the story came apart quickly. Have you spoken to this Pennicott? Gaspar asked. No, but it rattled Lesueur. It takes a great deal of concentration with a dozen of Athena's needles in you. LeSueur began making mistakes. He talked about surviving Indian attacks, which changed from Sioux to Fox, and how there had been spies, how there had been a great slaughter after the Philosopher's Stone was discovered, until finally one detail came into clarity. Not only had he found the Philosopher's Stone, but he brought it with him. He wouldn't do that, Gaspar muttered. The Wishwe must wield it against the darkness. If he gave Eos the Philosopher's Stone, all is lost. Don't be so dramatic, Garin mocked. Do you have any proof LeSueur gave the stone to Eos? Gaspar asked. I don't need proof. I have Athena, and if I give her a few more hours, I'm sure I'll be convinced of his betrayal. Either way, my new plans will spring into action. We'll either be in a race against Eos or in a race against Ormus. I can't afford to wait any longer. Then I'll get your answers, Gaspar said, and walked to the ship's brig. Pierre Charles LeSueur was stripped naked, tied to a long wooden table, and covered with a bloody blanket. Gaspar noticed the scars on his legs from Kyax's pyre. He walked around to the front of the table and stood in front of him so he could speak to him. He pushed aside the instruments of torture, causing Garin to step to the doorway. Don't worry about me, Garin. I'll get your answers. Garin rolled his eyes and stepped away. Gaspar moved closer to LeSueur's ear. Do you remember the day the peacemakers came to speak to you? This ancient group of tribeless prophets came to me first, asking if the stars had sent a warrior to fight the evil spirit No-Soul. At first, I couldn't believe a vile man such as yourself was sent by God, but then I saw the truth about your destiny. I hoped you were the Wishwe. LeSueur's weary eyelids opened, one swollen with a red prick mark upon it. Behind Gaspar, a table with 100 needles and several knives of various fashions waited to be used. He picked up a simple knife. I'm the one who can save your life, Gaspar said. And I don't even know if you deserve to live. The she-devil will return soon to get the truth from your lips. You will not survive this confession. I know the secrets of the peacemakers. I know the story of the white egg and Wishwe. I've been to the haunted valley and have seen the blue earth. And I know about the evil spirit known as No-Soul and the Wintermaker. What happened to the Philosopher's Stone? LeSueur closed his eyes. I had to protect Winona. I made a promise. Where is the stone? It was alive. We found it at the bottom of the excavation. When Aurel touched it, it burned the flesh from his hands. A spirit lived inside of the stone. It moved inside the white rock like pulsing blood. The unholy heat it gave off filled the space. LeSueur groaned. It was evil. Gaspar, how could I leave it there with Winona? What did you do with it? I was surrounded by enemies, and even well-intentioned allies, and it became obvious what I had to do. You made me promise. I did what you wanted. Fight for the future, rather than living for the moment. I nursed his wounds, and then sent him back to our enemies. And I waited until we were off the coast of Bermuda, in open water, and then I sank the ship. I made sure the damn thing rests at the bottom of the ocean. With the blade in hand, Gaspar stood inches from LeSueur's face, tapping his nose with the flat of the blade. Does Eos know it rests in the sea? Yes. I told Alexander Lahoulier the same truth I just told you. Why did he hold back? Why did he let himself be tortured? Then why did they send you back? LeSueur hesitated. The Sioux still control the region, and they needed me to return to help secure it. A half-hearted lie. But the stone is lost. LeSueur moaned and sobbed lightly. Just kill me. My wife has already slit my throat. Why do you say that? Marguerite's undone everything, and I have nowhere else to turn. It's only a matter of time before my wife's cousins learn of my betrayal. Undone what? The location of the stone is no longer a secret. She gave Eos the Almaric map while I was away. The stone is not the only thing Eos is searching for. Merrick, the Wintermaker. He knows. He's telling the truth. We need him. Gaspar cut the bonds from LeSueur's feet, then walked back up front to cut his hands free. As soon as the final bond was cut, LeSueur's hand clamped onto Gaspar's arm like a vice. The giant had him. Chapter 35. La Rochelle, France. The next day. After being dead for 3 days, Pierre-Charles LeSueur returned to the land of the living, beaten and bruised, especially his battered hands and knuckles. Stripped down to his underclothes and bloodied, he walked back to the docks as locals along the coast gasped and gaped. This is my chance. I could run to the hills and never look back. In his gut, Pierre-Charles LeSueur knew his days were numbered. Gaspar gave him another life, even if he served as bait for a larger trap. The plot also gave him a final chance at revenge. I've lost everything. At least, I'll get my revenge. Glancing at the docks to confirm Joseph Lemoyne and the Loire left port, LeSueur walked right up to the port authorities. My name is Pierre-Charles LeSueur, and I just killed 3 of my abductors. The lie worked. The port sergeant on duty immediately brought him in from the streets and set him down in a chair at his office. For the next hour, the office buzzed with orders and excitement about what had happened to him. The apologetic port sergeant explained, "We suspected foul play when you vanished during departure. We found a dead Englishman with incriminating evidence." Yes, Lahontan effectively put the blame on Newton. I'll sum it further. Yes, when those Englishmen grabbed me, I stuck one of them with a knife. But then they threw a bag over my head and got me off my feet. They brought me to a building down by the point where they kept me tied and tortured for the past few days. I finally broke free of my bonds and strangled one of them before the others showed up. I beat one of them to death with my bare hands and turned the knife on the other. I could take you to them if you want. In truth, he had pulled Gaspar in for an embrace, his only ally left in the world. After Gaspar informed the others about the new details about the Philosopher's Stone being at the bottom of the sea, and the Almaric map being in possession of Eos, LeSueur thought Baron Lahontan might kill him on the spot. The pirates seemed willing. Instead of being impulsive, Lahontan listened as wise old Gaspar came up with a plan to test LeSueur's truthfulness. Lies built upon lies, built upon lies. Even now, the port sergeant had to confirm another of Gaspar's lies. You'll stay here with me for now, and I'll let my men confirm the duties. Your servants came to me when you didn't board the Loire, and I let them know about the dead Englishman. Good. Lahontan's plan worked. Now we'll see if Gaspar's plan will work. LeSueur looked down. Could I get a towel to wipe off some of the blood? The port sergeant quickly obliged. While he waited, he sorted through what Lahontan told him about the Priory assassin. It was only a matter of time before Newton came for me. Gaspar saved my life again. I owe him this. I don't suppose my belongings are nearby? We didn't know what to think, so everyone agreed to load them up and send them to Fort Maurepas, where your family could sort out the details. Do they think I'm dead? I informed the captain of the Lower about your sudden disappearance, and we had no details other than you missed the launch. The servants lingered for the next 2 days, and we notified the authorities about your suspicions. Good. Then Lemoyne will believe I was attacked by Newton's men. This just might work. I don't suppose you know when another ship sets for the sail for the Gulf? I do, in fact, the port sergeant said with a mischievous grin. I was talking to a friend of mine about the Pelican girls. I don't know what that means, Lesueur admitted. The Pelican is a ship docked across the harbor at Rochefort. The Chancellor is sending 20 virtuous young women to the new Louisiana colony. I'm sure a nobleman such as yourself could do worse. But first, let's sort out this mess. Sit down and we'll see to matters. Yes, let's sort out this mess. All of Lesueur's plans had come undone in the past 2 years. Newton knew about his betrayal, and Eos sent him back to certain death. Marguerite and the Lemoynes could learn once they arrived in Louisiana colony. I likely will have been executed in front of my own children while Marguerite and her cousins watched. How soon until the Pelican set sail? It was supposed to follow the law, but I've heard there is an issue with the hull, so the Chancellor is trying to keep the women chaste until the ship is ready. If you want quicker passage, I could... No, Lesueur interrupted. More time allows Lahontan time to properly set the trap. If the Pelican is sailing to the Louisiana colony, I'll book passage on it. Is there any way I can send news ahead so my relatives know my plans? Of course, the port sergeant answered. I must do this for Winona, even if I'm killed in the process. Chapter 36. Havana, Cuba, May 9th, 1704. For the better part of 2 centuries, the territory of New Spain expanded since Christopher Columbus first arrived in the Caribbean. Possessing Florida, the lands west of the Mississippi River, Mexico, and Central America, Spain shared control of South America with Portugal. The heart of its financial empire was controlled of the largest island in the Caribbean, Cuba. With wealth pouring out of the Americas and back to Europe, colonial Cuba found itself a target of other nations fighting for control of the New World. Throughout the 1600s, the French, Dutch, and English invaded the island, resulting in the building of the fortress of Castillo de los Tres Reyes Magos del Moro, which allowed Havana to grow into one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. With the War of Grand Alliance over, ships from all nations, including the French Pelican, used Havana as a key port. From the port in Havana, Luis Armand Guerin watched as the tall masts of the Pelican drifted into the channel to the ringing of bells. 2 small escort ships accompanied it. Suddenly, the city went from preparing for defense to preparing for trade as the French flag announced the nature of the visit. Guerin prickled with anxiety as the big frigate passed by the protective walls that guarded the port built along the western shore. Men, women, and children ran down to the docks to await the travelers from the ship. Months earlier, it had been decided Pierre Charles Lesueur would die in Havana, with or without an assassin. So Guerin sat in the shade of the little tavern deck as the kitchen staff prepared for the rush of travelers. He'd been waiting in Havana knowing the true predator waited in the Cuban shadows. The rest of Garen's wolves followed the big freighter since it reached Cap Haitán in Hispaniola. The Pelican was unlike any other ship that had visited the port of Havana in recent weeks. 4 priests, accompanied by 4 nuns, led a colorful procession of 20 young women dressed formally from toe to wide-brimmed hat. In the heat of summer, the scene was almost ridiculous, leaving the Cubans as stunned as he was. Bienville's brothel, someone said near him, referencing the rumor that the Lemoyne brothers requested maidens for the Canadians that were building the new colony. The Catholic escort given to the young women indicated that they were far from being prostitutes or orphan peasants. Garen kept his good eye on the docks. If Lesueur walked off the ship on his own accord, Garen's wolves would kill him. If Lesueur was carried off the ship, Gasper's trap continued as planned. Next came a parade of 75 soldiers, laborers, and even a few families of women and children. A new conflict, the War of Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War, as it was being called in the colonies, had delayed supplies and reinforcements to the French colonies of Louisiana and Alabama, making the arrival of the Pelican a welcome sight. Where is Magistrate Lesueur? The 2 escort ships were just tying up when 4 men carried out a passenger on a stretcher. 2 men could handle a normal stretcher. 4 men meant they carried a passenger of some size. Garen remained motionless as he watched those watching the Pelican. Lesueur's going through with this. Is he actually telling the truth? No sooner did the body get brought past the dock than a stranger emerged to take command. The Eos assassin? The large body was quickly transported to a nearby inn, with a small entourage staying with the body. When it was brought inside, Garen smiled and waited. Conveniently, an English doctor happened to be nearby, slipping into the inn moments after Lesueur was brought inside. While the Pelican girls became the talk of the town, another rumor quickly spread about the new magistrate of Alabama falling sick with yellow fever. Garen heard the news himself, albeit from half a room away, as Dr. Thomas Barrow arrived in the tavern to tell another man quite loudly about Magistrate Lesueur's declining health. The arrival of Barrow meant the bait had been taken. Garen sipped his coconut beverage and prayed for restraint. An hour later, Narrowbon entered the inn and confirmed the story that the Pelican would be remaining in port as they waited for the health of the colony's new magistrate to improve. A few minutes later, Jimmy Duke rushed over to Garen's favorite spot in the tavern to view the harbor and say loudly, "Magistrate Lesueur has taken a turn for the worse." Let's see what we've caught in our net. Outside of the hotel, more of Garen's men waited, but he walked right past them, with Jimmy Duke peeling off to provide security. He marched up the stairs to find Dr. Barrow pacing outside of a closed door. "The fool might have killed him," Duke grumbled. Stepping inside the room, the scent of Lesueur's disease filled the air, in this case a mixture of urine and lemon. The source of the odor could be seen upon Lesueur's body, tainting his skin yellow, although only a superficial coating, not the jaundice caused by a failed liver. Lesueur turned to the doorway, a red circle on his forehead with a trickle of blood coming down the side of his nose. "Don't worry, he's alive. I just knocked him unconscious." Lesueur, dressed in a white linen tunic, sat upon the chest of the Eos assassin, Bartolome St. Clair, whose nose had been smashed, bending to one side, still oozing blood that covered his face. "Help me tie him up." Garen rushed over to the side of the ogre, and together they turned over the unconscious assassin and tied his hands and feet. It was then that Garen noticed how St. Clair's fingernails had been removed in prior torture. He's not going to spill secrets. "Barrow," Garen called out, prompting the doctor to quickly step aside inside the room. "I want the coffin brought up in plain sight, and for you to prepare a final will and testament for LeSueur to sign. He's only got a few hours to live. Barrow smiled as he helped prepare for his second abduction. As he ran off, Gaspar came up the steps to join them inside of the room. Your ridiculous plan seems to have worked. Gaspar had discreetly traveled aboard the Pelican for the final stage of the plan. A feigned bout of yellow fever contracted on Cape Hattan. He also made sure LeSueur didn't try to escape his fate. Charlie Johnson, Garin said, nodding to LeSueur. We can't call a dead man by his given name. We'll need a new identity for him, one that will make people think of an English commoner rather than a French aristocrat. So in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, I baptize you, Charlie Johnson. Garin made the shape of the cross upon LeSueur's forehead. Do you bear witness to the baptism of blood, Addario? I do, Gaspar said, and shook his head. And then the three men all turned to face Bartolome St. Clair. Chapter 37, Havana, Cuba, moments later. Well, the gang's all back together again, Luis Armand Garin declared to the other three. I had hoped it would be you waiting here in Cuba, but I can hardly believe our good fortune. What's the saying? If you want a job done right, do it yourself. LeSueur finished tying up St. Clair and slid away from their prisoner. He glared at Garin for a moment before rummaging through St. Clair's apartment for fresh clothing and water to wash the yellow film from his body. Ironically, Luis Armand Garin continued, by showing up to kill LeSueur yourself, you've granted him a new life. Funny. Garin made himself comfortable on a chair beside the bound prisoner. I couldn't be certain if LeSueur's preposterous story could be believed, so we snatched Charlie at the port of La Rochelle. Granted, we thought we were going to torture him to death to find out what happened to the Philosopher's Stone. But the more we learned about his encounters with Isaac Newton's Priory, the Almaric map, and his most recent meeting with Alexander Lehoulier, the truth slowly began to emerge from all the lies. Do you remember Chief Gaspar of the Platoon? St. Clair winced through his pain and predicament, the only sign of recognition. Of course you know him, Gaspar teased. You made it your business to know everyone that came and went from Montreal, especially your enemies. But, being an agent of Eos, perhaps you overlooked him because he was a native. Without Gaspar's help, I might never have figured out your personal interest in killing LeSueur. Remind me of your connection, Gaspar? Father Marquette, Gaspar said with hate in his eyes. Oh, yes, the man who washed away the sins of Candiaranc and baptized a new Christian named Gaspar. The Order of Eos sent you to kill Father Marquette and steal back the Almaric map, which they'd obviously been using to locate the legendary Lost Kingdom where the Philosopher's Stone can be found. Poisoned wine? LeSueur hesitated. He'd been a boy when his master died. His torment lasted for days. Unfortunately, Bartolome, your torment won't last for days. We can't afford to bring you onto our ship for more fun. The plan is to put you inside of the coffin for Magistrate LeSueur. You've wronged all three of us at one point or another. Garin leaned down closer to his face. Where did you learn that I was an agent of the periphery? Slit my throat and be done with it, St. Clair responded. Garin laughed. You're fierce, but I once spit my own eyeball at my own torturer. Alas, I don't have time for games. I remember a dinner party, a May Day party, when I first arrived in New France, and I bet you had your suspicions then. My treachery on the frontier was likely learned when I sabotaged forts and all but handed the Great Lakes back to the Sioux. I shouldn't have lingered for as long as I did. I'd not only located the Lost Kingdom, but I'd also thwarted French efforts to return for years. Behind them, LeSueur redressed in St. Clair's own clothes, tearing off sleeves and stretching pants over his tree trunk legs. I visited the Joliet family to offer my condolences and financial support from the periphery. In the end, you were determined to kill anyone associated with Father Marquette. When did you finally learn that Pierre Charles LeSueur was the young Don's assisting Father Marquette? St. Clair sighed, his eyes closed, resigned to his fate. Charlie, do you want to answer this one? This little tidbit likely saved your life. Just let me kill him and be done with it, LeSueur grumbled. Garin gestured back and forth between the two. I just need a minute for all of this to sink in. He snapped his fingers. That's right. Marguerite. Everyone in Montreal knew of her beauty, but it turns out she was a Delilah. Sorry, Charlie. That's a bit harsh, isn't it? She likely didn't mean anything. After all, her cousins were all powerful members in the Order of Eos. Etienne Delhut was a friend, a colleague of her husband. When the map surfaced, you knew that LeSueur was the lost Dons who'd kept and hidden the map all those years. And if he had hid that truth from the Order of Eos, that likely made him a Jesuit spy. While everyone else in Eos made plans for LeSueur to return to the frontier to continue his fine work, you needed to finish the mission given to you years earlier. Tell St. Clair the truth, Charlie. I'm not a spy for anyone, LeSueur shrugged. Father Marquette was a decent man, and I swore to get revenge against the men who killed him. LeSueur's eyes softened for a moment as he looked to both Gaspar and Garin, who not only spared his life, but had given him his chance at vengeance. A knock came on the door. Gaspar armed himself and answered. It's LeSueur's coffin. Your coffin, Monsieur St. Clair, Garin said, standing up and walking to the far side of the room to clear space. Dr. Barrow, Jimmy Duloc, and Benjamin Horn wrestled the wooden box through the doorway. It's time. Gaspar stepped forward. Before we let LeSueur kill you, do you have any last words? Garin rolled his eyes, but to his surprise, St. Clair cleared his throat to speak. Chapter 38. Fun Call Madeira, 1704. Captain Dalziel pondered his options as he studied the burning island. What has happened here? Prepare for battle, he shouted as he continued to check the horizon for any ships coming or going. The crew of the Salome immediately stopped gazing at the pillar of smoke and went to their duty stations. Once he satisfied himself that they were all alone on the sea, he put his looking glass down and spun the navigational wheel. Get the cannons ready. We're going to swing around the point and surprise them. Did a volcano erupt? Why are there no ships in the area? The sailing routes to the New World were defined by trade winds and oceanic currents. To reach the Caribbean Sea and the Americas, the fastest route was not the most direct route. Ships from England, France, or Spain sailed south, past the Straits of Gibraltar, until they reached the Canary Islands, where the prevailing winds pushed storms and ships to the west. The Portuguese island of Madeira was the first island off the coast of Africa to serve as a landmark for sailors. The little island, whose export products included sugar and wine, was normally passed by in favor of the Canary Islands. But Captain Dalziel, chose a route less traveled. Even though his ship had seen plenty of battle, his new crew had no idea that their captain was one of the most wanted men on Earth after the attack of the Ganji Swai. Dalziel's former crew had taken the Emperor's frigate. Bloody hell, the port of Funkal has been destroyed. The small settlement of several dozen homes and buildings burned up and down the slope, including the beautiful plantation nestled in the hills. The harbor itself looked like the back of a porcupine, with not only masts sticking up out of the water from the sunken ships. Not a natural disaster, an attack. At the approach of the harbor, the small boats waved brightly colored flags, indicating submerged wrecks. As the Salome approached the harbor, Dalziel's first mate stood at his shoulder. Since the rape of the Ganji Swai, Dalziel had taken a new ship, found a new first mate, and murdered any witnesses to the incident. Two empires wanted him dead, so Dalziel cut ties and vanished for a decade before returning back to the Atlantic. My new crew has no idea what this is about. 15 years earlier, when Dalziel had first sailed from Scotland to the remote island headquarters of the Order of Eos, his heart swelled with pride at the beauty of the part. Madeira existed between the two Eos colonies, America and Madagascar, and served as a hub for information and transportation between two oceans. "Sir, a survivor!" his first mate called out. Dalziel barked out orders to his crew to slow the ship's approach. He gave the wheel to his navigator and rushed down to the deck as they approached the local boat. "What happened?" Dalziel asked. A young man, stained with soot and blood, stood up from his rowboat. 3 days ago, a fleet of 8 warships fell upon us, bearing no flag of origin except for a black flag with a cross of bones upon it. Veritas caput, the truth about the head. As a soldier for the Order of Eos, Dalziel had served Thomas II from their secret kingdom on Madagascar. If not for an impulsive, violent nature, Dalziel might have been an Eos priest rather than a pirate. He knew what Thomas II searched for in Africa, just as he knew what the Lemoyne family searched for on the American continent. "Cross of bones," Dalziel repeated. The young man nodded. "First they fired on each ship in the harbor, targeting them one by one as if practicing. Then they turned their guns to the docks, blasting it into oblivion. Not once did they make any demands. Then a force of about 100 men from each ship disembarked, but instead of butchering the population and taking slaves, they circled the Lady of the Mountain," he said, pointing to the steep mountain overlooking the bay. They targeted Alvarez. His looking glass went to the beautiful estate built upon the hill, which now burned dark and lifeless. Years ago, he'd been a guest. Here at Madeira, the Grand Master for the Order of Eos, Marco Alvarez, orchestrated the ancient purpose for the Men of the Dawn. Instead of showing patience, Alvarez sought personal glory by finishing the quest in a single generation. His arrogance brought far too much attention to Eos and ultimately cost him his life. Their new enemy taunted them with their new flag. Crossbones, but no skull. "I've never seen it before." Dalziel knew his symbolism. A black flag means surrender. A red flag means no quarter. In Templar history, the skull and crossbones had existed for centuries. For enemies caught upon the sea, it was a barbarian's way of bellowing death at the top of his lungs. But to those versed in Eos lore, it represented Mimir's skull, which whispered the secrets of the universe to Odin, which he recorded upon a black stone. For generations, Eos had scoured the world for those ancient treasures and locations. When the Catholic Church tried to exterminate the Templars on Friday the 13th, 1307, they did so because they discovered the truth behind the Templar Knights. Misinformation had led the Church to the conclusion that the head belonged to a god named Baphomet, and the imprisoned Templars being tortured spun lies and truth into their confessions. Ultimately, the Catholic Church tried to kill them to the last man. If it had been the Catholics, the symbolism would have been a red flag. This flag is black. Surrender what? What happened to Governor Alvarez? They killed him. They killed everyone. At first, they rushed around like madmen with no one in their path, but vanished for 3 hours. But then we saw platoons advancing up the mountain. They killed Governor Alvarez and his entire family, removing their heads and taking them to adorn their ships. Alvarez kept no treasure on the island because of its vulnerability. During the splitting of the Elm at Gizors, the Templars kept all the stolen treasures, which they safeguarded until they could be placed in secure vaults out of reach from the Catholic Church and its allies. The Priory of Ormus knew all the legends and lore, but came away from the schism without the treasures. Ormus did this? After all these years? The 100 men you spoke of, they circled the mountain? Explain, Dalziel insisted. While the 7 warships blasted away at the town, the single ship put its men ashore, but they didn't engage in the obvious fight. Instead, they practiced maneuvers against an invisible enemy. Hours went by before they engaged Governor Alvarez's estate. Practiced, Dalziel muttered. How long did they stay? After killing Alvarez and his family, they came down to the port and killed anyone they could find. They didn't even steal provisions, and a day after they arrived, they left. Which direction did they sail? South. To Africa. Ormus cut off the head of the snake, and now they are coming for the old treasures. One pirate ship could not stop a fleet of 8 warships. And this man has seen my face. Kill him, Dalziel said, pointing to the survivor. His men dispassionately killed the man, then shot holes into the rowboat to sink it. None of my men know I serve the Order of Eos, so I'll play the part of the rogue pirate. Dalziel narrowed his eyes. Obviously, this black fleet left plunder behind. The fat ox is bleeding, and we will feast like a pack of hyenas on her flesh. We'll enter Funchal with guns blazing, take as much pillage and plunder as we can carry, but by nightfall, we will set sail for the Caribbean. His first mate barked out orders, but a few minutes later, he hung at Dalziel's elbow. Explain to me what has happened. The less you know, the longer you'll live. A great war has begun, and this is not a war between nations. A great lion has feasted here, and soon it will be feasting on its favorite prey. And what prey is that, sir? Hyenas, Dalziel explained metaphorically. Pirates like us. Fortunately, the great lion was heading east to Madagascar, and I must head west to warn Eos about what is coming for us all. Chapter 39. Canal de la Tortue Hispaniola, 1704. Here I go again, ready to jump from the cliff and float upon the breeze without knowing where I'll land. Luis Armand Guerin hadn't seen Tortuga for almost 5 years, but a hope still remained. Soon, his crew and ship would assemble again. Just a few miles off the northern shore of Hispaniola, the small island put a smile on his face. Beside him, Pierre-Charles Lesueur gripped the railing. Should we be concerned about those ships? 3 Sylph ships anchored off the coast of Port de Pas. Don't worry, Charlie. Those ships are allies that can't be so easily bought. He stomped his boot on the deck of the Malay. The periphery has nurtured alliances with the oppressed, and in turn, they willingly give their support. With the addition of this ship and my ship, I command a fleet of 5 ships. For that reason, they will remain here, protecting people without a nation. What people? My Huguenot friends. They are refugees from Catholic France with nowhere else to turn, even though the periphery has no official denomination. Its current allies are mostly Protestant. Against Eos, I would like to believe the Jesuits are my friends also, despite our recent differences. Just like you are now my friend, now that you are no longer LeSueur. Along the shore of Tortuga, the sails of another ship came into view. Mon chéri. As instructed, the Adventure Prize had undergone a radical transformation in recent months. Just as Louis Armand Lahatin had become a new man, Gaspar had become a Dario, and Pierre Charles LeSueur had become Charlie Johnson, his trusted first mate. He didn't care about keeping LeSueur's identity hidden from the crew, but at any port, Captain Legrand and first mate Charlie Johnson were the only names to be used. LeSueur's thick black beard had been shaved, leaving his chin whiskers braided into short ropes. The big lumberjack also shaved his head, wrapping it in a bandana. Instead of the garish clothing of his captain, LeSueur wore only a leather vest, leaving his hairy chest and arms to be bronzed by the sun. For his introduction to the men, the new first mate dressed for battle, with 2 small swords strapped to his tree-trunk thighs, a pistol strapped to his baldric, and most importantly for effect, a hook in his left hand to mask his missing fingers. I still can't believe a little runt like you is leading a fleet of pirates, LeSueur said with a little bit of disdain. Wow, where did the fingers thing? By the grace of God, I like to believe, Garen admitted, and with a little bit of luck. During their passage from Cuba to Tortuga, Garen tried to explain the past decade's events to his former rival turned ally. He explained his bad luck with Captain Kidd and his chance encounter with LeSueur back in 1697. LeSueur already understood the truth about Newton and the Priory of Ormuz. He next explained his good luck when they took the Quedagh Merchant, giving him clues about the next stage of the adventure. Garen turned back to his ship, looming larger and larger. The ship you see is the Adventure Prize, formerly known as the Quedagh Merchant, the one with the carvings in the brig, the old language found on the Almaric map. You see, this is why you'll be my first mate. First, men will fear you because of your size, and second of all, you're well versed in the lore we're about to chase. A lost kingdom, LeSueur repeated the story. A buried kingdom. It explains why the Philosopher's Stone was found so far from obvious civilization. Alas, losing the stone did not end their efforts, which is why we'll need to sail back to the Indian Ocean. Killing St. Clair didn't quench the fire in my heart. I look forward to killing more Eos men. Garen chuckled at LeSueur's sentiment. I mean to return the Quedagh Merchant to Emperor Aurangzeb and her owner, Captain Corgi, in exchange for a Josiah Pharaoh. Why wouldn't the Moguls just blow us out of the water for piracy? Because we'll have something they want, something very personal. I know where to find Long Ben Avery. He smiled, thinking of his night with Queen Rhaena. Hopefully, our deal stands still. We're going to trade Avery for Pharaoh? LeSueur asked. His life mocks the mighty empires. Avery is a pure villain. I will bring him to justice, and in turn, unlock the secrets of the dawn. The secrets of the dawn? Haven't you thought this through? You dug up the key. Solomon understood the nature of the key. Aurangzeb seems to suspect, and I know Pharaoh understands the truth. A key is used to unlock a vault. While the rest of the world chases after a lost key, I chase after the vault. I have no life to go back to, LeSueur added. I'll be your right-hand man in this quest. Chapter 40. Bassa Terro Tortuga, 1704. Under instruction, Charlie said little and acted as Garin's shadow once they reached the little village on Tortuga. Now, Pierre-Charles LeSueur sat beside him in the sand, a first mate. The other officers sat with him also. The celebrations and revelry ended hours ago when Garin offered each of them a final chance to leave when the sylphs finished loading at dusk. Would he have let me leave, I wonder? LeSueur felt the stubble upon his head. No. Garin needs me as a bodyguard and sounding board when times get tough. That night, Luis Armand Garin's full crew gathered around the large bonfire upon the beach. The light reflected off the still waters of the channel and illuminated the 350 berthen-ton vessel anchored and ready for their long journey. Earlier, he'd been introduced to the new crew of almost 100 men, including the 13 veterans who'd survived Robert Culliford's blade. In the past 2 years, Garin's officers gathered up enough for the Great Crossing. Unlike most other ships, these men chose to serve. So on the morrow, gentlemen, Garin began, we become the right hand of God. 3 great enemies, the Order of Eos, the Priory of Ormus, and the Mogul Empire of Aurangzeb, are about to tear each other apart limb from limb, and in the chaos, we will strike to keep these mighty titans from crushing the weak and oppressed. He turned to his left hand, where wise Gaspar sat in the sand. Gaspar will be our shield. He will go ahead of us to the Mississippi River and organize a resistance to the French, keeping them from uniting the continent along the Mississippi River corridor. Like I have, he's looked death in the eyes and is now willing to give his life to keep our enemies from achieving their goals. Even though the details of our plans have changed, our enemy has not. Somewhere out there, Robert Culliford still serves the Order of Eos. And where we find the Order of Eos, we will also find the hidden Templar vault. Garin looked across the fire to Benjamin Horne. Master Gunner Horne and I share knowledge of these ancient treasures, and in my absence, I'm sure he's told you only a fraction of what is out there. Those of you with only greed in your hearts will be the first to fall, and those with righteousness will be rewarded. That's what the priest would say. The friendliest officer serving on the ship was Master Gunner Benjamin Horne. The Ethiopian did not look like other Africans LeSueur had met. Tall and angular with a lean face, Horne's complexion was lighter, and instead of short ebony hair, he wore it in swept back braids, leaving linear rows that flowed back from a silver band that circled his head, creating a curtain of flowing braids. A slight tinge of red could be seen in the tips of his hair and the whiskers of his thin beard. Even though he flashed a bright smile and happy eyes, he displayed a mangled right ear and a brow that seemed wrinkled as if in deep thought. This man also has secrets. Quartermaster Manuel del Toro immediately seemed to hate him the most, so whenever matters of importance were discussed regarding the ship, LeSueur took a step back and never, ever offers opinion or even a grunt. Sailing Master Narrowban, the eldest member of the crew, gave sideways glances as if dissecting a strange monster they'd pulled up from the deep. Throughout the previous day, he grumbled about the shortcomings of the men and did his best to keep them on course. The chubby English boatswain, Drake Murray, remembered him from the attack on the Queue Sirene, when LeSueur killed a dozen men before he was beaten to submission. This created more whispers amongst the curious crew. The blond-haired American from Boston, Jimmy Duke, confronted him shortly before the bonfire. "I know who you are," he said with a wry, dimpled grin. "I've heard the tales from New France." "Does my name matter?" Lesueur asked. "Oh, sure. You're Charlie now. But I know who you were. Murray hasn't put it together, but I think I have it figured out. You are educated, which allows you to know more than French. But when I was a boy, I read all the tales coming out of the frontier. Many of the tales spoke of a giant whose feet shook the ground as he walked, creating lakes. Instead of a horse, he rode upon a massive bull buffalo, and when he fought the savages, he went into battle with 2 axes. You are Paul Bonjean, aren't you?" Lesueur laughed at the alias he'd used after burying Father Marquette. "I have become a myth?" "You're right, of course," he mocked. "With my giant buffalo, I carved out the Great Lakes, and during the winter of the blue snow, I single-handedly cleared the lands of the Sioux of all trees. And when I take a shit, islands are formed large enough to plug mighty rivers. Oh yes, I am Bonjean." The mocking did the trick to silence Duke, but hero worship did not flee from his eyes. Let them fear me. Dr. Barrow also took an interest in him, wanting to inspect his scars. "You are certainly a brute of a man, and I'm sure your scars could tell 1,000 tales." Without a defined purpose, except to keep Guerin safe, the Lesueur spent most of his day working with the ship's carpenter, Giovanni Naufragio. Whether sawing or chopping, Lesueur knew it was an opportunity to secure his place with the crew. Seeing him hack down 12-inch logs into kindling reminded men of what he could do to their soft flesh. But now it was the voodoo cook, Pierre Dulac, who stared at him strangely while Guerin finished discussing the route to Madagascar. Lesueur avoided the cook's glare by listening to Guerin talk about the history behind Eos. Then Dulac stood, taking a moment to stare once more at Lesueur. Few noticed Dulac walk away, for dozens of crewmen sat in rows behind the ring of officers. But when he returned, he caused a stir. "Is that a chicken?" Dulac stepped into the light of the bonfire, bringing Guerin's speech to a sudden end. "What are you doing, Dulac?" Dulac all but ignored Legrand, and he took off the head of the chicken. Chanting foreign words, he began to circle Lesueur, sprinkling blood on the sand and his legs. By the time he finished, a hush fell over the men, and when he finished his strange chant, he loudly said, "Aye Bobo!" When the men didn't respond, he snapped at them. "Aye Bobo!" he said, and they repeated it back. "This one," Dulac said with wide eyes as he studied Lesueur, "this one has Cho Job. His destiny had been written in the stars. I've never seen such Cho in a man, except for our brave captain." Then Dulac fell down, bowing in submission. "And you were worried the officers wouldn't respect you," Guerin said softly with a smirk. Then he raised his voice to ask, "What are you doing, Dulac? Explain yourself." For a moment, Guerin thought of the appearance of the comet, the Serpent Star, as Winona called it, and her insistence that he was a prophesied warrior called Wishwi. Then he looked at the wry smile on Guerin's face. Is this all a show? "A Job has a powerful but wild spirit," Dulac preached to the congregation, "capable of both good and evil. When I see him through the fire, I saw both of these spirits fighting each other for control. So I fed these spirits the gift of blood. Now he shall be given new life." Paul Bonjean, the fur trader on the frontier. Pierre Charles Lesueur, the explorer. Now Charlie Johnson, the first mate. Gaspar leaned forward, nodding in affirmation. Dulac wasn't finished. "There is a legend of a creature called Zombie in my culture, of a man who dies but is not allowed to die until he fulfills his destiny, and in the state of life and death He wanders the earth. Many of us live borrowed lives, just as our ship has lived borrowed lives, and is once again brought back from death. Dulac sat back down on the opposite side of the fire, but then Gaspar shared tales of the frontier with his crew, including all of the near-death experiences and a retelling of what had happened with the Philosopher's Stone. When morning came, Luis Armand declared a new name for the ship that had first been called the Queda Merchant and later the Adventure Prize. The dinghies came and went, bringing first the crew and then the officers, before finally returning for Luis Armand Guerin and Pierre-Charles Lesueur, who stepped aboard the newly christened White Zombie in honor of Lesueur. Chapter 41, London, England, 1704. Upon returning to England, Michael Sicard gave no thought to keys or vaults. The War of Spanish Succession grew by the day. Newton had unleashed his Black Fleet upon the Order of Eos in Madagascar, and Pierre-Charles Lesueur died of yellow fever in Cuba. Now Sicard turned his attention to other enemies of the Priory. His assignment was simple: find an author. His hunt took him to Fleet Street. He sat against the wall in a corner of ye old Cheshire Cheese Tavern in London, with a half-empty glass of beer and a leather-bound book in front of him. He had no poisons or weapons tucked away, only questions and a pocket full of bribe money. The fat man he'd fantasized about strangling for most of the day followed a tavern wench into the back room, and with a gesture from her, he gave an arrogant nod on his way to the table. "Sorry to keep you waiting," the fat man said. "My assistant said you have questions about a recent publication of ours." Sicard shoved New Voyages to North America by Louis Armand de l'Homme d'Arcy de la Hatton across the table. "Ah, one of our bestsellers. Who would have guessed?" "I am a great admirer of this Baron Lahatan, even though my friend tells me he is a fictional character." "Oh, he's certainly real," the fat man insisted. "After trying to find him, I'm beginning to believe he's a figment of someone's imagination. Now, I understand your publishing company only translated the manuscript from French into English, but I assume the profits from any sale should..." "You need to speak with Nicolas Godevelle. He's a French journalist who contacted me about the manuscript. He lives in Rotterdam now." "Holland?" Sicard asked. The rumors might be true. Baron Lahatan hides in Holland. "I know you are a busy man, but do you have a few minutes to talk about the details of the book? You've read it, haven't you?" "Of course, yes, and you can have my attention for the duration of a glass of beer." "If you read it, then you must have theories." He opened the book and turned to the page where it described Lahatan's journey deep into the frontier. His finger traced the route along the dramatically named River of Death and to the watershed of two great rivers. "This image here, what's it supposed to be?" The publisher leaned forward. It was much easier to see on the original drawing, but it's so small it's hard to see. What was it called? The Death Head." "Caput Mortem?" Sicard answered it to himself. A breadcrumb Lahatan left for the alchemists. But what is the truth about the head? Sicard closed the book. "Do you think the anecdote about visiting the Long River is true? Did he really travel deep into the American continent?" "Of course it's true." "Baron Lahatan is certainly real, but his story is a fraud. The only question is, why did he write such lies?" Sicard hoped to find the answers, because when he found Lahatan, he wouldn't give the Baron an opportunity to speak before he killed him.